Hi everyone, I'm sorry, Stjepan here. In this video I'm going to make an introduction to the Petrov defense, or the Petrov's defense, or the Russian game as it's also known in ex-Soviet and ex-socialist countries, Croatia being one of them. A defense which makes a lot of sense, sort of, and it intrigued me to study it further and further, I have to say, and I think it's one of the mysteries of responses to e4 and one of the defenses which needs to be explored more, which is proven by Fabiano Caruana, who has been playing it in recent years with great success. Now, talking about the Petrov, first let me show you the opening moves. e4, e5, the most classical response by white, with which white indirectly chooses not to fight indirectly for the center, but fight for the center immediately with the most logical move. And the move e5 is similar to c5, controlling the d4 square, and basically the move e5 stops the move d4. And the implications of the move e5 in modern theory mean that the player who plays e5 either knows nothing or knows everything. And I'm of the opinion that e5 is only played by the weakest and by the strongest players successfully, that is. Of course, everybody can play it. And after the move knight to f3, which is white's by far most common continuation, black's most common continuation is the move knight to c6. And after knight to c6, you have the Roy Lopez, you have the Italian, you have the Scotch, and there are tons of theory. There is, according to my calculation, more than 400 hours of work for you to only grasp the basics after knight to c6. And basically you are putting your game in white's hands, and of course, black can decide on several variations. However, white is the one who chooses what he will play here. And there are so many variations stemming from knight to c6 that it's almost impossible to learn all of them. And it's definitely very hard to learn all of them quickly. Now we come to the sidelines. And there are two more moves after knight to c3. Black can play the Philidor, the move d6, which we are going to cover in the last series in e4 openings. And black can also play the Petrov defense, or the Russian game, with knight to f6. Now, the most beautiful thing about the Petrov is that you avoid so many theoretical lines and so much theory that the learning curve is so much simpler, and it will, well, I won't say it's easy to learn the Petrov, but it will take you probably 50 times less than to learn knight to c6. That's the best thing. The second best thing is that the Petrov is irritating for e4 players. And I myself, being an e4 player, when somebody plays knight to f6, I want to throw up. Not really throw up, but I get frustrated because I know that there's only one really aggressive variation which I can play, and I know that black has a lot of drawing options and that black has a lot of peaceful lines he can enter, often involving a queen exchange. So e4 being the most aggressive first move, of course, e4 players tend to be much more aggressive than d4 players, and e4, the king's pawn opening, often leading to more aggressive games than the queen's pawn opening, is meant to be an open game, is meant to be aggressive, is meant to be tactical. Now, the Petrov defense is one of the few defenses for black which neglects white that luxury, and basically doesn't give white the option to play as aggressive as he would like to. So that's the second thing. I think that the Petrov defense is the best choice for taming aggressive players and playing against stronger opponents. And this is exactly the reason why I started studying the Petrov and why I included it in my repertoire. I didn't play it in a tournament game yet, but I think I will very soon. So, okay, let's talk about the opening. After knight to f3, white is attacking the e5 pawn, that much is clear. With the classical response knight c6, black simply defends. And then most of the variations are going to revolve around weakening the e5 pawn. In particular, the Roy Lopez with bishop to b5, which weakens the e5 pawn indirectly, threatening to take the knight in some variations. Knight to f6, on the other hand, creates black's threat. And instead of defending, it attacks the e4 pawn. So if you take my pawn, I'm going to take your pawn. That's basically what black is saying. It's not as simple as that, but it's a counterattack. We are going to look at 5 different variations. There are going to be 5 videos in the series covering the variations in detail, and this one is only going to be an introduction to make sure I can try and explain the basics of the opening and the main ideas for both sides. After knight to f6, white has 3 ways to respond, 3 good ways to respond. There are some sidelines like bishop to c4, but I wouldn't want to spend too much time on them, and I don't consider them as good, and neither does chess theory. First of all, let me just highlight 2 players and 1 author. The 2 players I would like to mention are Arthur Yusupov and Fabiano Caruana. And the author is Arthur Yusupov. He wrote a book which is about 400 pages long, going in great depth, in great detail about every single variation. And if you go through the whole book, I think that your understanding of the Petrov is going to be immense. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm working on it weekly, and it's a great book. He has a great writing style, and he might be a bit dry every now and then, but yeah, he gets the job done, and his work with Mark Dvoretsky is excellent as well, which proves that he's a great author. So, okay, the first thing I would advise you to do is take 10 or 20 games played by Fabiano Caruana and Arthur Yusupov. Maybe Fabiano Caruana should be your first choice, and study them, see the ideas, and see what the consequences of the Petrov are. One thing I would like to mention is that once you play the move knight to f6, you have to be aware that the opening is a draw for black with perfect play. I don't mean to say that the engines are going to draw every game, but strong players will. In the databases, there have been 14,000 games with the most common move, which is white taking the pawn. And out of the 14,000, white won 27%, 61% of the games were drawn, and you can calculate what little percentage black managed to win. With the second most popular move, d4, white won 33% of the games, and 54% of the games were drawn. With the third most popular move, knight to c3, 2,600 games were played. 33% of the games were won by white, 49% were draws, 18% were won by black. So definitely not a very aggressive opening for black, and not an opening you want to play if you want to go for the win, which might be confusing. Fabiano Caruana is the second in the world, perhaps not anymore, but he is close definitely, and he fought for the world championship. So how can you explain him going for a draw? Well, it's not a draw unless your opponent plays perfectly, and Fabiano Caruana knows his theory very well, knows the opening ideas and the middle game plans, so he often wins with it. Okay, now let's look at the most common variations. As I said, we are going to go in great detail into every single one in separate videos. Here I would just like to provide an introduction. Let me just say that the Petrov defense was named after Alexander Petrov, who is a Russian player from the mid-19th century. And basically the Western world calls it the Petrov defense, the Russian world and the ex-socialist world calls it the Russian game, because it was a Russian defense, or the Russian defense. In Croatia it's called Ruska obrana, which is Russian defense. Okay, after knight to f6, white has 3 main options. Let's look at knight to c3 first. Knight to c3 is the so-called 3 knights game. The most popular move by black here, which I wouldn't recommend, is the move knight to c6, which enters the 4 knights. The 4 knights can be entered from some other openings. You don't have to play 2 knight to f6. And there is a ton of theory here which isn't really the Russian game or the Petrov. After the move d4, you have the 4 knights Scotch variations, so we are going to be covering that in the Scotch defense. So I wouldn't want to go into the move knight to c6 too much. I wouldn't recommend this move. After knight to c3, if you want to play the 3 knights game in the Russian or in the Petrov defense, I would recommend the move bishop to b4, and we are going to go over this variation. It's very interesting, and I think that most players with white pieces who play knight to c3 are going to be expecting knight to c6 and a peaceful symmetrical game. However, after bishop to b4, the variations after knight takes e5, castles, bishop to e2, bishop takes c3, d6, knight d3, knight e4, castles, At least what you get with the black pieces is a healthy imbalance in which you gave white the bishop pair, but you have a better pawn structure. White, of course, has doubled pawns along the c-file, which means that any endgame is going to be, in theory, slightly better for you. And the bishops aren't really as powerful because the dark squared bishop doesn't have that much scope and it doesn't have too many squares to go to. You can imagine it going to g5 or to f4 or to e3, but none of these squares are really that strong. So after knight to c3 by white, the 3 knights game, I think that black has great chances with the move bishop to b4, creating an imbalance. Once again, if you go for the 4 knights, then you really can count on a peaceful game and on a symmetrical position, which is with best play going to end in a draw. The second move, I wanted to look at is d4. And d4 is the modern attack, or the modern Petroff, and d4 might be one of the most aggressive ways for white to play, but I still don't find it as good for white as the main lines. After d4, knight takes c4, taking the pawn. You can play knight to e5, which isn't considered that good. After knight takes c4, bishop to d3 is the main move. And after d5, defending the knight, knight takes c5, knight to d7, knight takes d7, bishop d7, castles, bishop to d6. You now have the classical Petroff structure, and it's symmetrical. I want to call it boring, but it would be unfair to call it boring. If white captures, which white isn't going to do, then you have an imbalance and you have the bishop pair, but you can't really hope for that variation. What you have is the typical Petroff center with the pawns on d5 and pawns on d4, and this is the structure you are going to have most often in the classical and in the modern. And it's really hard to do much here, and this resembles the exchange French and openings like that, which have a symmetrical pawn structure, and unless the players castle on opposite sides, then it's really going to be hard to create too many attacking chances. So I think that the move d4 doesn't really give white that much. That's why knight c3 and d4, in my opinion, should be avoided by white, and I never played them. I played the main line. So after knight to f3, knight to f6, the main move, of course, since black didn't defend the pawn, is take the pawn. So this is what we are going to be focusing on the most, and we are going to be looking at 3 different variations: the classical, the Nimzovich, and the Lasker attack, or the Hosiyar. And all 3 are quite interesting. All 3 are more aggressive than knight to c3 or d4 or on move 3. So knight takes e5, and this is by far the most popular response, and it's by far the most principled response. Let me just get one thing out of the way. There is one variation which I wouldn't recommend, and that's knight takes e4. This is the Damiano variation, which for a long time has been considered losing for black. I think it's worse. I don't think it's losing, and I can conclude that the worst case scenario, if black plays well, is you give up a pawn and you have some compensation. Still, I wouldn't recommend it. White's most principled response is queen to e2, of course, attacking the knight. And now note that there are traps which you could fall into. For example, if black plays knight to f6 here, seemingly saving his knight, then the move knight to c6 check wins the queen. And there are traps you could fall into. So after queen to e2, another move which is bad is d5, and after d3, queen e7, d4, queen e5, ed5, bishop d6. Once again, white is a pawn up, and white is going to trade the queens off, so white is simply better. The best response after knight takes c4, queen to e2 is queen to e7. However, after queen takes c4, d6, d4, d takes c5, d takes c5, knight c6, you have once again given up a pawn. White is a central pawn up. It is an overextended e5 pawn, but still it's going to be really hard to recapture it. Let's say bishop b5, pinning the knight, indirectly protecting e5. Bishop d7, renewing the threat. Knight c3. Now you could go for this for taking the pawn with black, but black is considered worse, slightly worse, but still worse. So after the move knight to e5, I would recommend that you don't go for knight takes e4, the Damiano variation, because it really isn't really isn't that playable for black, and you're basically accepting a worse position or being a pawn down, whatever happens. So after knight takes e5, I want to look at three different moves. After knight takes e5, there are several options for white. Yeah, okay. The move you should play is d6, chasing the knight away. And now there are several options for white. Knight to f3 is one of them. That's the classical variation. Let's say after knight takes e4, d4, this is the classical variation or the classical attack. And after knight to f3, knight takes e4. There are two more moves which white could play and where the variation branches out, and those moves are knight to c3 and queen to e2. And these I find fairly interesting. So just let's go over the opening moves once again. So e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to f6. I would recommend knight e5 for white because it's the most principled response. d6 I would recommend as the only move for black. So d6. White should retreat the knight. There isn't really much else to do. There is one variation with knight to c4, which is called the Paulsen attack. But I find it really strange because the knight ends up on e3, and I think it's disrupting the development. So I really wouldn't recommend it. So after d6, white simply retreats the knight to f3. And now you have to recapture your pawn. Well, you don't have to recapture your pawn. There has been one game played with knight c6 and one game played with queen to e7. Both were won by white, so recapturing the pawn is almost mandatory. So knight takes e4. And now three variations. Okay, d4 is the classical. And after d4, d5, you once again have the thematic Petroff center. Okay, with the pawns on d4 and d5. c3 and c6 aren't that common because the moves aren't really necessary. It's much more common for white to play the move c4 and accept an isolated central pawn if black wishes to do so. It's not the best move here, but let's say c4 takes, bishop takes. In many positions, white is going to have an isolated queen's pawn, which is going to be perfectly playable because white still has all the pieces on the board and has a chance for attack. The main move, however, is bishop to d3, knight to c6, castles, bishop to e7, c4 now, and black doesn't take, of course. Knight b4 is played, attacking the bishop, bishop to e2, castles. This is just one of the variations. This is called the Chigorin variation or the main line, and I think it's playable for both sides. However, I don't see too many prospects for a deadly attack, unfortunately. Okay, so this would be the classical attack or the classical variation. After knight takes c4, there are two much more interesting moves in my opinion. And first I'm going to go over the Cosio, and then I'm going to go over knight c3, which is my favorite variation. So the Cosio or the Lasker attack is queen to e2. Queen to e2 has been played by Magnus Carlsen against Caruana. In fact, I want to show you that game right now. Okay, okay, e4, e5. Caruana is black here. Knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight e4, queen e2. Now, of course, you have to defend your knight. There has been one tremendous defeat by Vishy Anand. Here, he played bishop to f5 and just lost the game immediately after d3 because there's no way to save your knight. So if Vishy Anand could do it, you should know that it's a mistake that could happen, and you should avoid it. So after queen e2, the main move is queen to e7. d3 attacking the knight, knight f6, knight c3, queen e2, bishop e2. And the problem for white here in the Cosio is that black can, as you could see here, trade off the queens. The second problem is that material is completely equal, the structure is completely symmetrical, which on the highest level means it's a draw, and on lower levels means still anything could happen, of course, but the chances of an equal position are huge. Okay, in the game, Fabiano Caruana went for the plan with g6, which I like. I do think it's weakening the dark squares, obviously. There are no more pawns on the dark squares on the king side, so it's kind of risky, but it worked for him. a6, stopping knight to b5, bishop f4, bishop g7, and it's a normal position with the queens off, in which Fabiano Caruana even accepted a structural weakness with the doubled c-pawns, but it was still enough to draw. And you can see that there aren't too many chances here. Okay, let's go back to the theory. After queen to e2, queen to e7, as I said, is the only move. d3, knight to f6 is the only move. Bishop g5 is the best move here. And after queen takes e2, bishop takes e2, bishop to e7, we have this position with the symmetrical structure. After knight c3, the move which Fabiano Caruana didn't play in the game we just looked at is c6, which is the most popular move, which is basically restricting the knight from entering d4 and from entering b4. And after c6, there is one way for white to play which I find interesting, and that's for white to castle queenside. If white castles queenside, the engine first of all will tell you that it's completely equal, but I think that there are some chances here. So regarding the Cosio, even though after knight takes e4, queen e2 might seem visually like the most aggressive move, I really think that, I mean, you're basically accepting a trade of queens, which with white pieces in an e4 opening, no, I wouldn't recommend you do. So, okay, for the last variation, I want to flip the board because it's my favorite with white pieces against the Petrov, and that's the move knight to c3. Knight to c3 is a provocative move, and knight to c3 is saying, I'm not going to let you draw, I'm not going to let you have a peaceful game, and whatever happens, we're going to have a fight, which is a great statement against the Petrov, because Petrov players, I'm not going to say they are cowards or scared to play open positions, but they probably prefer positional play, equal positions, or positions with the queens traded off. So knight to c3 is definitely a statement. Now the most obvious move is knight takes, ruining the pawn structure, and that's the only move black should play. Retreating the knight to f6 would just give white a tempo, and after knight to f6, white can develop the bishop freely, be up in development. So after knight c3, take on c3. White should always recapture with the d-pawn, opening up the bishop, d takes c3. And the point of knight to c3, the Nimzovich attack, is bishop to d3, queen to d2, castles queenside going for an attack. There are ways for black to fight against that, but this is, in my opinion, the best way to create an imbalance and to create an attacking position. Note that you are accepting a worse structure, of course, and in any endgame, black is going to have an advantage, not a big advantage, but still an advantage because your pawn structure is ruined. But your goal here is not to trade off the pieces, not to enter an endgame and to crush black before an endgame happens. Bishop e7, bishop e3, castles, queen d2. Here there's an annoying move for black. Knight d7 is the main move, but after queen to d2, white can be stubborn and play bishop to e6, not allowing you to castle. And there's a very interesting variation here, which I'm excited to cover in the detailed video, but let's just say that it isn't wise to take the pawn. So in this structure, let's return to the main move, knight to d7, castles, knight e5, h4. You can see that white is even now accepting to have double isolated f pawns on f2 and f3, an isolated pawn on h4, and white is going all in for an attack, not really caring about the consequences, which might be costly in an endgame. So the Nimzovich attack is definitely, in my opinion at least, the best way to fight the Petrov or the Russian game. Okay, so these are the 5 variations that we are going to go over in detail in separate videos. I'm going to start with the main lines after knight takes e5, the classical, the Nimzovich and the Cosio. After that we are going to go over the 3 knights game and the modern attack. And I hope that the series will give you another weapon in your repertoire against e4, and it definitely can be an easy weapon to add to your repertoire, because it's really hard for white to avoid that. White can avoid it with 2 bishop c4, the bishop opening, but more often than not, in 99% of the games, white is going to play knight to f3. So there aren't too many sidelines. You have to learn if you're afraid that white is going to avoid the Petrov. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you got something from this video. Thank you very much for the kind comments and the support, and stay tuned for more chess. Please let me know what you think about the Petrov, and see you soon. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Petrov defense, or the Russian defense, with the classical variation or the classical attack, which is also the main line of the Petrov. And I have to say before I start, this is one of the most heavily analyzed openings, and theory goes so deep that if you want to say that you are well prepared, you need to know about 25 or 30 moves in every variation, and there are more than 100 games in almost every variation at move 25. So very theoretical opening, and basically it wouldn't be wise to play it unless you know the theory. So I hope I'm going to at least be able to give you the main ideas for both sides and give you the basics of the variation. By the way, since it's now May 1st, I've finished my schedule until May 1st, which I published a while ago. And for now, I'm going to stop with the middle game videos. And I'm going to try to finish the E4 theory series. So I still have the Petrov, the Scotch and the Philidor. I'm also going to make one video about the Nimzovich defense, which was requested in the last video, which I sort of missed, and I think it's necessary, but it's only going to be one video. Philidor is also only going to be one video. And after I have finished the E4 theory, then I'm going to start the D4 series finally. I'm going to start with the King's Indian, and then the Semislav will follow. After that, I'm not sure about the schedule, but I'm going to arrange the openings. And I'm also going to start the Endgame series at the same time. So I still have after this one 4 videos in the Petrov, then I have the Scotch, the Philidor and the Nimzovich, and after that the Endgame series and the D4 series. So about the middle game series, I haven't finished it. I'm just putting a stop to it for now because I'm slowly but surely running out of topics. So if you have any suggestions about videos in the middle game series, they will be more than welcome. You can send them here in the comments, you can send them through Lichess, you can email me, whatever. If you have a nice topic for the middle game series, please let me know. So okay, the classical variation of the Petrov. Let's get into the opening. So okay, after e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, the Petrov defense or the Russian defense or the Russian game or the Petrov or whatever. We're going to look at the main move, knight takes e5, black's only move d6, knight to f3, and now black's move, knight takes e4. And here we already said we are going to look at 3 options, knight c3, queen e2, and the move we are going to look at now, d4. d4 is the main move, and that's the classical. After d4, white is basically expanding in the center and leaving the knight on e4 without harassing it. The other 2 moves, knight c3 and queen to e2, both attack the knight. So this is the most indirect move, and it sort of gives the most options to black. Black here has one good move and one move which I wouldn't recommend, and the engine wouldn't recommend it either, but still it might be a nice sideline to know to perhaps confuse your opponent. The main move is d5. So after d4, d5, you have the Petrov center with this symmetrical pawn structure on both sides. Now, most often it's going to end up with the white pawn on c4 and with the black pawn either on c7 or c6. So it's not going to be symmetrical. White is going to have slightly more space, and perhaps white is going to have an isolated queen's pawn if black decides to capture, which is very rare, but still it's a possibility. And the other move, which is a sideline, is the move bishop to e7. With bishop to e7, white isn't being challenged in the center. So black isn't taking up central space with d5, which would be the most sensible things to do. Black is instead trying to develop as soon as possible. Now here c4 isn't such a popular move. Taking up space immediately, it's much better to continue your development. There have only been 6 games with c4, and the main move, bishop to d3, there have been 250 games. And let me just tell you that in this variation, white won 35% of the games, 58% of the games were drawn, and that leaves, 7% wins for black, which is just horrible. Even though there's a game between Anand and Carlsen in which Carlsen played this move, so what do I know? The game was drawn. Bishop to d3 is the main move, and after bishop to d3, knight f6, the knight returns back. No need to protect the knight now, which you could have done the last move. Castles, h3, white plays h3 to stop bishop g4 and knight g4. Rook to e8, c4, white now does expand in the center, not really stopping d5 but making it harder to play. Knight bd7, knight c3 developing only after the pawn has moved. Knight f8 is the main move, coming into g6 and rook to e1. And this position is very favorable for white. According to the engines, it's more than +1.5, and I think it's, let me turn on the engine, look at the advantage, +1.5. I think it's more than understandable why. White has more space, all of white's pieces are free to move, both bishops have scope, while at the same time black's best minor piece, the bishop on c8, is yet to be developed, and it's staring at the h3 pawn. So black is going to have a rough time developing and creating any sort of initiative. which is why, even though Magnus Carlsen played it and drew Anand, I wouldn't recommend the move bishop e7. It just accepts being slightly worse. Instead of that, d5 should be your move, and this expands in the center, takes up space, and basically equalizes the game. Now the position is fairly even, and it's really hard for white to gain anything if black doesn't go badly wrong. With the move d5, 28% of the games were won by white, 61% were drawn, so still not too many chances for black, but that's what you get with the Petroff. Let's continue. Bishop to d3 by white, knight c6. Bishop to d3 by white. And here we are going to look at two moves. These two moves are very different and both are extremely heavily analyzed. I actually want to, one of them is knight c6, one of them is bishop to d6. I want to look at bishop to d6 first because it's simpler. The main line is knight c6. So bishop d3, bishop d6. Bishop d6 leaves the option of c6 or c5, which is rare, doesn't develop the knight to c6, so obviously the c-pawn can move. After both sides castle, white now plays c4 and black plays c6, which is impossible in the last variation because the knight is in c6. So this is, you could argue, more solid for black, but on the other hand, black has taken up a square for his knight on c6, and black is now lacking development. White is ahead in development. Here there are two moves, and both of them are theory up until move 20 or more. And I'm going to show you the variations, but what I would advise you to do, because there are more than 100 games in these variations, get any database. You could use Lichess, which is free, you could use ChessBase, whatever. Look at the games and see the conclusions. Now, the first move I would like to look at is queen to c2, which is the second most popular move, and here there have been 323 games with knight to a6, and they all featured the same series of moves. 35% won by white, 51 drawn, 14 by black. So pretty one-sided variation, and basically white is playing for two results. Knight a6, now a3 is played, stopping knight to b4. Bishop to g4 attacking the knight, and now the madness begins. This variation is forced, and you basically need to know it by heart. Knight e5 is played, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, knight a to c5, attacking the bishop, leaving these two pieces on pre, seemingly, because both the bishop and the knight can be attacked by f3. And white does play f3, but black has a move in mind. Knight takes d3, queen takes d3, and now knight c5 attacking the queen, queen to d4 attacking the bishop, knight to b3 attacking the rook, and now queen g4, knight a1. Now if you count the material, black has a knight, two rooks, and the queen, and white has a knight, a bishop, and the rook and the queen. So for the moment, black is the exchange up, but let's continue the variation. Bishop h6, g6, of course, white is able to win the exchange back. Bishop f8, queen f8, cd5, queen c5 check, king h1. Still theory, still a lot of games played on from this position. 10 games to be precise, with knight c2, which is the main move. All 10 games were drawn, so it seems to be a pretty drawing variation. Just let's look at it once again from the top. So knight takes e5, d6, knight f3, knight e4, d4, d5, bishop d3. We are looking at bishop d6 now. Castles, castles, c4, c6, and we were looking at the move queen to c2. Now, if you play the white pieces, you need to know the variation. If you play the black pieces, you need to know the variation. And I would say that the easier part, because I know this already, I could recite these moves because I've studied the variation in depth. The hard thing is to look at the bad moves your opponent can play, and there are tons of them. And even though they are not the best moves, they will confuse you and you will not know what to do. And in tricky positions like these, it's really hard to find the best variation on your own without spending too much time. So my advice to you would be, look at the queen c2 variation, take games and study them. There is a great game, Carlsen-Kramnik from 2011, which Carlsen won. Anand Caruana from 2018, which Anand won, so Caruana lost in the Petroff. Kasparov-Shirov from 2001, which Kasparov won. So basically white is winning a lot of games, And most of the highest rated games are one-sided, but still you are not, and I'm not on the level of Carlsen, Anand or Kasparov, so we won't be able to punish the bad moves quickly. So study those games, look at the bad moves played in those games and trying to find some more. It would take a year to show you all the variations here, so I'm not going to go too much in depth, but let's just look at the main variation once again. Knight a6, so a3 stopping knight b4. Bishop g4, knight e5. And now after knight e5, the possibility arose for f3, but black has his own ideas. Now in a real game, if you were black here, you would surely notice f3, but if you are unaware of the variation, you might go wrong. So let's look at some. Bishop f5 has been played. White wins most of the games. Bishop h5 has been played. So definitely, if you don't know the best move, bishop takes e5, you're going to be in trouble. d5, knight ac5, attacking the bishop. f3, knight takes, queen takes, knight c5, attacking the queen. And now you might think that it's okay to protect the b3 square, but the bishop is actually hanging, so if you attack the knight, this square is going to be available, and the best thing is to do is to attack the knight, because you can win the exchange back with bishop h6. Queen d4, knight b3, takes, bishop h6, g6, bishop takes, queen takes, cd5, queen c5, check, king h1. Knight c2 is played from here on. The knight probably wants to go to d4, so white is going to try and stop that. And I would say that white is better. If you ask the engine what it thinks, the engine thinks it's slightly better for white, but almost equal. I think it's easier to play for white because you have these two pawns, and black still has to get the knight out of trouble in order to do anything to those pawns. White has ideas of e6, d6, and an attack, while at the same time black is far away from starting any sort of attack. Now let's go back after d4. Turn on the engine, d5, bishop d3, bishop d6. We are still looking at castles, c4, c6. White doesn't have to play queen to c2, this forcing line, even though it seems it's much better for white. The main move is rook to e1. This is now called the Staunton variation, and there are plenty of variations here, 10 different names we already went over, so I won't even mention them. Bishop f5 is the main move. Queen to c2 now. Challenging the bishop indirectly, knight a6 once again, a3 once again, but the difference is now that after bishop f5, black is able to play bishop to g6. c5, expanding, sort of getting an Alekhine structure with the pawns on c5 and d4. Bishop to b8, knight to c3, and now f5, defending the knight. And this is, I would say, one of the trickiest variations for white to play. Even though white is supposed to have an advantage and black's pieces don't have that much space, white's pieces don't have that much space either. If you ever take on e4, white is going to have a very dangerous pawn in your position, which is going to disrupt the communication between your pieces. And you don't really have attacking chances with this pawn here. So knight e2 is the main move, coming into f4. Knight c7, knight f4, bishop e8. And all of black's pieces seem to be on the first two ranks apart from the knight. And white does seem to have a very nice square here on e5. So when I was looking at this position, I was looking at variations with bishop to f1, knight to d3, and trying to get something into the e5 square, which seems very sensible. It's very hard for black to trade everything off because he only has one dark squared bishop, and it's really hard to get the knight anywhere near to challenging the e5 square. I mean, the knight would have to be on d7 or f7 or g6. So it's really hard to do that, in my opinion. And if you manage to get something into e5, you should have an advantage. However, the main move here is h4. Stopping g5, even though g5 seems fairly risky. a5, a4, queen to f6, queen to b3. And yeah, the position is very complex, I have to say. It's mind-boggling and it's really hard to grasp. It might surprise you that this position is actually in black's favor. 88% of the games were drawn, 13% of the games were won by black, so white doesn't win from this position. And the engine will tell you that it's equal or slightly better for black. So this variation I don't like for white, which is why I avoid the classical variation of the Petroff in general. So after d4, if you go for the classical, if white goes for the classical, if you are black, I would advise this variation: d5, bishop d3, bishop d6, castles, castles, c4, c6. If white plays rook to e1, which is the main move, if you know everything, you should be better and you should have a better position. So bishop f5 is the move. Queen c2, knight a6, a3, bishop g6, c5, bishop b8. Don't be afraid to bring your pieces back. Knight c3, f5, knight e2, knight c7, bishop knight f4, bishop e8. And even though your pieces seem strange, this constellation of two pawns and knight in the center is very strong, and it's really hard for white to do anything. And it seems that black has a positional edge. The plan for white, one I already mentioned, bishop f1, knight d3, something into e5. The second plan I was looking at was b4, a4, b5, and trying to do something on the queen side, because your bishop is aiming there, you have a rook perfectly placed here, and your queen is also looking at the queen side. So white definitely has to be sharp and aggressive in this line. And still, I think if black plays well, black stands slightly better. Okay. Now let's look at the other move. We just looked at bishop d6, which is very interesting. And if white plays queen to c2, then yeah, it's almost a forced draw, but better for white. And if white plays rook to e1, it seems that black is better. But still very theoretically heavy openings, and yeah, you need to know them. Now the main move is knight to c6, not giving black the option of c6. White castles, bishop e7. And here there are several options. Bishop in this variation with knight to c6, the bishop doesn't go to d6. It goes to e7. And now white can play several different moves. Two sidelines are knight b to d2 and knight to c3, which I don't really like. After knight b d2, knight takes, bishop g4, c3. White is sort of passive. I like the move c4 in the variation, and I like the fact that white takes space. So I think this is slightly too passive, and this pin is annoying, even though you do have two very nice bishops, much better than black's bishops that are staring at nothing. The second move after bishop to e7 is knight to c3, allowing black to double your pawns, which is something I don't like. So knight takes c3, b3, bishop g4, rook b1, rook b8, b6 would be a bad idea because of this pin. So we have doubled pawns. You can perhaps undouble them with c4 and taking on d5 later on, but still I think it's unnecessary. Still slightly better for white, two nice bishops and a pleasant position, but I wouldn't recommend these two variations. After castles, bishop e7, the two moves I think are best are rook e1 or c4. I think c4 is the best move, and it is the main move, so let's look at rook e1 first. After rook e1, you are still keeping the option of playing c3, which is fine, but as I said, I think slightly passive. Bishop g4 is always going to be played by black. c3, the pawn was now indirectly under attack, so if bishop takes, queen takes, knight takes, d4 would be winning for black. And now once again f5, which is a very annoying move in this variation. So for black, I would really recommend studying the lines with f5, because f5 seems to disrupt white's pieces tremendously, and it stops most of white's attacking chances, because the d3 bishop is blunted, the e4 knight is perfect, and yeah, that's why I have a problem with d4 with the classical, because the knight is often left on e4, which is really annoying. Queen b3 is played. Black doesn't protect this pawn. It would be well, actually, why doesn't black protect this pawn? There has to be something here. I'm not sure. Queen takes b7 has been taken only 12 times. Oh yeah, rook f6 is the move. Okay, yeah, I forgot. And the queen is slightly misplaced. The black pieces are becoming active. After queen to b3, bishop takes f3, yeah, and gf3, and black is slightly better after rook to g6. So it's very scary to take the pawn. So after queen to b3 castles, white usually plays knight b to d2, and now actually this should be an option, because now the variation doesn't work. Bishop f3, knight f3. So now black has to parry the threat. So black plays knight to a5, chasing the queen away. Queen to c2, knight back to c6, and now b4. Yeah, it's an aggressive variation, and still a lot of theory. More than 60 games from this position, and one-sided for white once again. But I really don't like the variation for white, because I'm not sure what to do with my pieces. Once again, the d3 bishop is blocked, and the e4 knight is the biggest problem I have. And it's really hard to get your knight into e5 now, because the knight from c6 can take it. And yeah, I don't like this variation for white, because this structure seems doesn't seem too solid. So after castles, bishop to e7, we are looking at the knight c6 line. I wouldn't recommend the move rook to e1, even though the engine thinks that white is better. I think c4 is the way to play. And what c4 does in the classical Petrov, it undermines the d5 pawn, which is protecting the annoying e4 knight. And this is why I think that c4 is a must-play move. Because if you do not undermine the defense of e4, then the knight is going to be on e4 forever. And after f5, you are going to have to live with the knight for the rest of the game. Now the variation continues: knight to b4, harassing the bishop, bishop to e2, castles, knight to c3, bishop to f5, chasing the knight away with a3. And by the way, we are now looking at more than 1300 games. This is the most theoretical variation of the classical. This is in fact the main line, and this I think it's 30 something moves of theory, so it's really hard to analyze everything, but at least the main line you need to know. So okay, after a3, black doesn't retreat the knight immediately. Black captures because white is undermining d5 anyway, so black captures on c3. Knight c3, bc3, now the knight retreats, knight c6, and white plays rook to e1. Rook to e8 by black, which is normal, and now c d5, queen d5, bishop f4. And now the huge difference in the position, even though white has an isolated a pawn and the bad c3 pawn, which might become a weakness, and white also has a weak c4 square because it cannot be defended by the pawn. So if this bishop ever gets traded off, then knight a5, knight c4 could be a real problem for white. Even though white allowed that, white doesn't have to deal with the e4 knight, which is why I think that this variation is favorable for white. And all the pieces seem fine. Rook ac8 is the main move, believe it or not, and still more than 500 games. This is by far the most popular move. 800 games with rook ac8, bishop d6, only 53 games. So rook a to c8 with the plan of c5 later on, and still defending the c7 pawn. You don't want to give it up. So bishop f4, yeah, it was a threat, but black perhaps doesn't have to do anything about it. Still, the theory says that the pawn should be defended with rook because it's a multi-purpose move. c5 could come in handy. Bishop d3 by white, queen d7, defending the bishop, rook to b1, attacking the b7 pawn, b6, and now b6 is a weakening move because of what we already mentioned, bishop to b5, pinning the knight to the rook if the queen moves. So white has a tricky move here, d5. And if queen takes d5, then white is winning. So the variation is queen takes d5, bishop to b5, pinning the knight to the rook and threatening to exchange the queens. So if black takes the queen, rook b takes, the knight is dropping, or the exchange is dropping. So the main move after queen takes d5, bishop b5 is actually queen to c5, but now the queen is very awkwardly placed and the knight is pinned, and the pawn was worth it. It was worth to sacrifice the pawn because now this is a very dangerous pin for black to deal with. And yeah, it's basically winning for white. So after d5, black shouldn't really take the pawn. Now we are going into another tricky variation, which you simply have to know. You don't move the knight. You play the intermezzo bishop d3. And after queen d3, you don't move the knight because the pawn is pinned. The queen would get captured, so white cannot take on c6. The move is bishop takes a3. And now white is a pawn down, as you can see. There are, however, options of rook a1 later on, winning the pawn back, but there's a very tricky move and a nice move that white could play here, knight g5. Now white is threatening to take on h7, of course, winning the game because it would be mate. The king cannot go to e2. And now g6, knight to e4, threatening knight f6, winning the queen. So queen to f5. And now you might wonder what the hell is going on. Why can't c6 be taken? Well, it can be taken, but the bishop on f4 is now loose. So the intermezzo move once again, bishop takes c7, rook takes c7, and now bishop takes c7 wasn't only to take on c6. The point of the move was to lure the rook away from the defense of e8. So now after bishop takes c7, rook takes c7, you have knight f6 check, and after queen f6, rook e8 check. King g7, dc6. Count the material now. White is an exchange up, and yeah, both sides have 5 pawns. Black is about to win 1 pawn, the c6 pawn. So black is an exchange down for a pawn, but the position is perfectly playable because black's passed pawn on a7 can be very dangerous. And yeah, I would still rather have white, but yeah, it's an imbalanced position. And by the way, 106 games were played from this position, all with the move bishop c5, and yeah, 92% of the games were drawn. So it's a very drawing variation, but as I said, it's drawing on the highest level, and on our level you can't really say what's going on. It's very tricky, but still I would rather have white. The engine says it's equal or slightly better for white, so not a big deal. So let's look at the main variation once again. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes c5, d6, knight f3, knight takes c4, d4, d5, bishop d3, and knight c6, the main move. Castles, bishop e7, and for white I would really recommend that you play c4, undermine the e4 knight. Every other move seems equal for black. c4, knight before attacking the bishop, you definitely don't want to give the bishop up, so bishop e2. Castles, knight c3 challenging the knight, bishop f5 defending, a3, and now you don't immediately retreat, you interpose knight c3, so knight c3, bc3, knight c6, rook e1, rook e8, cd5, queen d5, bishop f4, attacking the c7 pawn, so rook a to c8 is the main move, defending the pawn and perhaps preparing c5, bishop d3, queen d7, rook b1, attacking the pawn, b6, d5. If you're black, don't take the pawn with the queen, it's a trap. Bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, you don't have to move the knight, the pawn is pinned, bishop takes a3, knight g5, white sacrificed the pawn, but he's going to be much better now after winning the exchange, g6, knight e4, queen f5, bishop c7, luring the rook from the defense of a8, takes, knight f6 check, queen takes, rook takes, king g7, dc6. I know it's a very tricky variation, and once again I would recommend that you take this position, study. Out of the 100 games that were played, take 10 or 20 with the side which you are playing. If you play white, take the games in which white won and vice versa. And before this move, from the start of the variation, take at least 50 games and try to find the sidelines and the strange moves and the bad moves which you can't really be prepared for otherwise. Nobody is going to show you the blunders. Try to solve them before they appear on the board. And it's hard to do, it takes a lot of time, but it's really fun to do, and it's, I think, the best way to study chess. So take the board, put the position on the board, and try to find the move which would make you think. If you can find it, and if it's not theory, then it means it's bad. If you don't know how to punish it while training, then you are going to use the engine or the books or something, which is going to make you stronger for the real games. And very often it's going to happen that your opponent plays the blunder you already defeated at home. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much for the kind comments and for the support. I'm sorry if I'm not able to answer you immediately or answer all the comments. I have a very busy schedule at work lately, so I don't have too much time. Thank you anyway. Make sure you know that it's appreciated. And yeah, once again, let me know if you have any good middle game subjects. Thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stjepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Petroff defense with a very unsound variation, the Cochrane Gambit, which white can play, sacrificing a piece. As requested by a subscriber, I decided to look into it. I didn't really take the variation seriously, but I've spent the last day, I would say, studying it and actually found a variation which seems okay for white, and I found a game which proves that on the highest level. We're going to look at that game, and I'm preparing for a league game which I'm playing tomorrow morning, and I plan to play a very aggressive variation, so I was kind of in the mood for looking at gambits and suspicious lines. I'm just going to say before I start that this should be handled with care and that it's really bad for white if black knows what he's doing, but as I said, there are variations in which white could be fine. Strangely, the engines don't seem to be able to evaluate the position properly. So okay, let's get into the opening. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, the Petrov, and now white goes for his most principled move, knight takes e5, d6, and now knight to f3 is the main move. As we have already seen in the last few videos, we were looking at knight to f3, knight takes e4, and then we were looking at d4, the classical, knight c3, the Nimzovich, and queen to e2, the Cosio. We are also going to look at the move knight to d3, which was the move Magnus Carlsen chose against Fabiano Caruana in the World Championship match. The game ended in a draw. And today we are going to look at the Cochrane Gambit. And the Cochrane Gambit is simply sacrificing the knight, not retreating it, but taking on f7. So knight takes f7. If you turn on the engine now, it's almost -1 for black. It's a piece for a pawn, so definitely not an equal trade. Piece for 2 pawns, really. So black has nothing better to do but take the knight. That's the first thing black has to take. Any other move loses even more material, so it's not playable. I was looking at the move queen to e7, but it doesn't really do much after knight takes, and whatever black does here, white is going to be fine. So after knight takes f7, black has to take. And now we come to a crossroads of what theory says is the most common move and what I found is the best move. And the two moves played here are either d4 or knight c3. Both of them seem to be playable, however d4 seems to end up worse for white in almost every line, and knight to c3 seems to end up equal if white knows what he's doing, which is really strange. But after knight to c3, as we are going to see, white develops a strong initiative, and if he plays the proper plans, then black is going to remain undeveloped, and especially his ha rook is going to be out of the game, which is going to be ample compensation for white being a piece down. But let's look at d4 first. Now d4, after king to f7, d4 has been played 120 times. White won 38% of the games. So white actually scores well, but the problem is that black can play well as well, and then white loses basically. So if black is unprepared, d4 can be winning, but if black is prepared, which most Petroff players are, then d4 is losing. So d4, black's main and only response basically is c5. If black takes the pawn, then black is losing immediately, giving back the piece. Let's just get that out of the way. So after d4, if black is greedy, takes the pawn, then the move queen h5 check wins immediately. You have to play g6 or king here, whichever one you play, white is going to take the knight. Moving your king somewhere else loses also, so the best defense is this. And after queen to d5 check, you give up the knight, so this isn't playable. So after d4, black should continue with c5. After c5, white has two moves. One of them isn't really that good, and even though it might seem aggressive and developing with tempo, it's a bad move, and that's bishop c4 check. After d5, e takes d5, bishop d6, castles, you don't really have an attack anymore, and black is going to develop his rook to e8 and be perfectly fine. The fact that your d-pawn is blocking your bishop sort of helps black, and even though white here has 3 pawns for the piece, I think it's better for black, much better for black, because you're playing a piece down and your bishop is out of play, and it's going to remain out of play. So after c5, I wouldn't recommend bishop c4 check, even though it might seem tempting. I would recommend dc5. This is the main move and the best move. The pawn is pinned, of course. Black cannot take because the queen is hanging. There are some tricks with bishop check, but not at the moment, because if you take, your pawn is blocking the bishop, so you're simply losing the queen. So black has only one response, and that's the move d5. Another response is knight c6, but I think that's inferior. After d takes c5, knight to c6, bishop c4 check, bishop e6, bishop takes, king takes, castles, seems to be better for black, and you can see that white is lacking development, of course. And usually when you sacrifice a piece, you are doing that for the initiative and for rapid development and for bringing all of your pieces next to your opponent's king. In this case, it's visually obvious that white doesn't have anything because no pieces are developed. So after king f7, queen d3, protecting the pawn. Queen d7, rook d1, queen e6, c d6, rook d8. This pawn isn't really dangerous. Once again, doesn't really do much. White has 3 pawns for the piece now, but black is defending well, and in fact this position is busted. It's almost -2 for black. So bishop f4, knight h5, bishop g3 takes, bishop d6, taking the pawn, and after knight c3, rook h to f8. Black is going to tuck his king away to g8, and white can basically resign. So the move knight to c6 I wouldn't recommend. So after the move knight to c6 is also playable, but d5 is better. So d5. D5 releases some of the tension from the center on the d6 square, and gives several options to white. If you take here, then black is going to recapture with either piece and simply be better. So the best move, and the only move played here, is the move e5, chasing the knight away. And now you can either move your knight to e4 immediately, which isn't really considered that good. Queen to e8 is considered to be a better move. After queen to e8, now the pawn is pinned, white cannot capture, so queen to e2, unpinning, knight e4, knight to d2, offering a trade, but black can simply capture here, knight takes c5, knight to f3 defending, knight c6, bishop e3, bishop e6, castles, and this position is basically losing for white. White doesn't have anything, white is a piece down, and there is almost no compensation. Whatever white does here, he's going to be worse. And that's, in principle, why the move d4 doesn't work. So if after knight takes f7, king takes f7, white plays d4, he is accepting to be almost -2 and the piece down for almost nothing if black plays well. So what I would advise the Petroff player to do here, study the move d4 as it is the most commonly played move, study the defenses, study the plans, and learn this variation after c5, dc5, d5, e5. This is the key variation. It's going to be played most often, and after queen to e8, black is fine. I want to look at one game. I want to look at 2 games actually, but we are going to look at them later. I couldn't find too many high-rated games with the move d4. The highest rated game is Nigel Short, Alexei Shirov, and Shirov of course won that game. This is the only super grandmaster game, so Nigel Short is the only super grandmaster that went for d4, and it's basically not a good move. So let's look at some other options. After knight takes f7, king takes f7, I would recommend the move knight to c3, and knight to c3 seems very interesting. Now, what's the difference? The difference is that you have another piece in play, and black can't really stop d4 in the future anyway. So once d4 comes, it's going to be much stronger because you have another piece in play. This also means that after developing your bishop, your rook is also quicker to come into play, and all of your pieces sort of have scope. d4 is happening, d4 is going to open up the center, so whichever side is able to bring more pieces to the attack is going to be better. So if black cannot do anything to stop the move d4, then why not develop your pieces first? So this is my reasoning. I think it's okay. The only thing black can do to stop d4 is a Sicilian idea with c5, and c5 is the main move, but as we are going to see, it doesn't really do much to stop d4. c5, white now can develop with tempo. The main move, bishop c4 check. After bishop c4 check, black's best try is bishop e6, trying to exchange some pieces, and now white gets to draw the black king out to the center to play. Bishop e6, king e6. Now you play d4. Okay, so now that d4 has happened, you once again have the pin on the queen, so you are threatening to take, winning a pawn. The king is stuck in the center as opposed to the last variation where it had entry to the g8 square from f7, so that's favorable. Your dark squared bishop is open, you can castle, you can get the queen to the center to e2, to f3, to g4, to h5, and you can get your a1 rook into play faster. So after d4, black's best attempt here is to play king to f7, just trying to remove his king out of harm's way, and you win a pawn, dc5. Once again, black cannot take. So knight to c6 is played here, castles, dc5 now, and now queen to e2. you don't really care about black winning the pawn back. You're already a piece down, so it's pretty irrelevant. And now we come to the point of the variation. After queen to e8, which is considered the best attempt for black, stopping the move e5, white plays the move f4. And in my opinion, after f4, white has enough compensation for the piece. The reason for that is that the h8 rook, as I said, is completely out of play, and it looks to remain that way. Well, on the other hand, white is a few moves away, let's say bishop e3 or bishop to d2, and rook to d1, and all of the white pieces are developed. Along with that, white is looking forward to the move e5, disrupting black's defenses and removing the knight from f6. And once the knight is removed from f6, you can see that the queen has c4, the queen has h5, and all of the pieces are coming in. So the main move here is rook to d8, and white plays e5, knight to d5, trying to exchange, but now white simply ignores that and continues with the move f5. F5 is the most aggressive move, and I've been looking at this variation for quite some time. The main move is to take on c3. Now, the other moves that were played, there are actually no more games from this position. It sort of stops here. But let's see. If black takes here with the queen, that's one thing. Then you take the queen, black takes, and you have the spin. So that's fairly annoying. If black captures here with the knight, then you can simply check here, and yeah, the game is much better for white all of a sudden. So these variations, I'm sorry, the engine seems to be turned on. So these variations can be fairly tricky, and I think it's very easy for black to go wrong here. So let's look at this position again. f4, rook to d8, e5, knight to d5, f5. So black must be reasoning, okay, why can't I just take the e5 pawn and be carefree? Queen takes seems fairly reasonable, but as I said, this move rook to d1 is annoying and almost unstoppable, giving white the advantage. If you take with the knight, then queen to h5 seems almost winning. So black has to be extra careful here, and I think that an inexperienced player isn't going to find knight c3 over the board. So it's very tricky. But knight c3 is the best move. Now white doesn't immediately recapture, he interposes the move e6 check to make sure he doesn't hang a pawn afterwards. King g8 now, bc3, and black continues with bishop to e7. In this position, even though the engine says it's equal or slightly better for black, I would rather have white. The simple reason for that is that I'm basically an exchange up, and black has a knight for a rook. The h8 rook isn't going anywhere for a while, and my e6 pawn and my f5 pawn are creating sort of a bind on black's king position, which is hard to break through. The dark squares are open for my bishop, the rook can come into the game, the queen can come into the game. You can basically get 3 attacking pieces into play in a matter of moves. You also have some ideas with rook to b1, putting pressure on the b7 pawn. You can develop your bishop to a6, get your other rook into the center. So it's a very rich position which promises possibilities to white. On the other hand, what can black do? I have no idea. I've been looking at this position, and if I were black, I really couldn't find the move. I would be struggling to find the move. Let's say white continues normally, like bishop to f4, trying to put the bishop on the best possible active square. What can black do here? How do you untangle from this position? It seems very hard. So yeah, if we come back to the opening, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight e5, d6, knight takes f7, a very risky gambit, but there are some possibilities for white. So here I wouldn't recommend the main move with d4, I would recommend the move knight to c3. And let's see how Veselin Topalov played this position. King takes f7, knight to c3 was played. And we are following the line, we just looked at the main line for a while. c5, bishop c4 check, bishop e6 check. King takes e6, d4 now, king to f7, dc5, black cannot take, he plays knight c6, and here instead of castling, Veselin Topalov played the move queen to e2, which is a slight inaccuracy. Castling is best, but still it's playable. He went for the same plans, the difference is that his king is now stuck in the center and sort of open to attacks. So queen to e2, queen d7, bishop to e3, another slight inaccuracy, once again best was to castle. dc5 now, f4, rook to e8, e5. We have the same idea, but with the king still being on e1, which you could argue doesn't matter, but I think it does. Knight to g4, rook to d1, attacking the queen, queen to f5. Now he finally did castle, and we have a very similar situation. And the h8 rook is once again out of play. White has a lot more activity, and white has better rooks, and you could argue all better pieces. h5 was played here by Vladimir Kramnik. Bishop to c1, saving the bishop. Knight to d4, getting all of his pieces into the game. But now queen c4 check, king g6, h3 chasing one knight away, knight h6, knight b5, threatening to exchange the other knight, a6, and now the exchange does happen. And here, I think white is better. Once again, first of all, you haven't sacrificed anything really. You have 3 pawns for the piece, and black still has to solve the issue of the rook. So I think this is the most successful example of the Cochrane gambit for white, which I've managed to find. This game was Topalov versus Kramnik, played in 1999, so before the engines were good, so it was really hard to find engine lines. And the engine is confused throughout the game. I mean, here it says it's equal or slightly better for black, but as I said, which human would have the black pieces here? I don't think anybody would. The game ended in a draw after a while. Okay, another game I want to look at is Vasily Ivanchuk versus Li Chao, played in 2016, so a more recent game with engines used. Once again, we have king takes f7, knight c3 by Ivanchuk. He knows that it's the best move. And here Li Chao played a very strange idea, g6. This move I haven't really seen before, that's why I chose this game, and Li Chao won with the move, so this might be a great idea for black. d4, king g7, now he has an extra square for the king, which is fine, bishop e3, knight g4 attacking the bishop, bishop f4, bishop e7, queen to d2, rook f8, bishop e2 attacking the knight, g5, bishop g3, knight c6, and now, if you look at the evaluation bar, white is already much better, so you can see that it's easy to go wrong. So my conclusion was that g6 isn't such a smart idea if you follow it up with g5. However, the fact that he was a piece up paid off later on, as we're going to see. Knight d5, f3 was apparently the only move to gain that advantage promised, but it's really hard to find such moves. h6, bishop takes g4, f3 now, bishop e6, castles queenside. Now after this series of moves, it's apparently almost over and much better for black. So you can see that it's an up and down position in which you have to play extremely accurately. And I think that Vasily Ivanchuk wanted to surprise Li Chao with the Cochrane gambit, and then he got surprised himself because g6 is a very rarely played move. So if you want to play this position with the white pieces, I would recommend looking at this move because the players with black are most likely going to know it. Even though it's not ideal, it sort of confuses your plans, and you cannot go for the normal ideas with d4 later on and stuff like that. So coming back to the opening, I really don't know what to say. I might try it out in a blitz game. I've never played it, obviously. I will try it out in a blitz game because I know the ideas now and I'm going to practice it because I feel that in a blitz game it could pay off. It seems safer than the King's Gambit and I like the King's Gambit, so I'm going to try it. So let's just go over the main moves. I would recommend the move knight to c3 here. Black should play c5, bishop c4 check, exchanging the bishops, dragging the king out, now d4. King f7 is the main move. C takes d4 has been played, queen b6 has been played, but king f7 definitely better. dc5, knight c6 castles, dc5, queen e2, queen e8, f4. Remember this idea with f4 and then e5 and then f5. And I think this is key. If you push those pawns toward the black king, then the rook on h8 isn't coming out, and this is going to be your compensation and eventually your advantage. Okay, I hope you like this variation. I don't normally like covering gun sound variations, but this one was fun. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you've played it, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. Thank you. Hi everyone, Stepan here. With today's video I'm going to finish the series on the Petroff defense, and after that we are off to the Scotch. And today I'm going to cover two sidelines for white, with which white can avoid taking the pawn on e5, which is the main line and which is by far the most common move. Before I start, I just want to say, in response to a comment I've seen on the last couple of videos, where is the middle game series, as I've said a few videos ago, I want to finish e4 openings. I only have the Scotch, Philidor and the Nimzowitsch to go. And after I have finished the e4 series, then at the start of June, I'm going to start d4 with the King's Indian, and I'm going to start the endgame series. So for now, I'm done with the middle games. As I said in that video, if you have any suggestions for a middle game team, then please do post it in the comments below or email me, and I will consider making a video on that. And I'm going to keep updating the middle game series forever, probably, because it's inexhaustible, really. But for now, I want to finish e4 and start the d4 series and the endgames. So, sorry for the digression. Okay, let's get into the openings. We are going to look at two variations, the modern attack and the three knights. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, we are going to be looking at the move d4, which is the modern attack, and the move knight to c3. And both of these moves avoid the main lines with knight takes e5, which is, as I said, well, let's just see in the database. Knight takes e5, 14,000 games, d4, 4,000 games, knight c3, 2,500 games. So taking the pawn is very popular. And if you don't take the pawn, your opponent is probably going to be surprised, because most people expect you to take the pawn. So let's get into the first sideline. In my opinion, both of these are fine for white, not really a big advantage. It's not as if you have a winning surprise weapon which is going to win the game, because of one reason. It's not easy for black to go wrong, and there aren't that complicated. There's no room for big blunders at start of the opening, and most players who play the Petrov are going to feel comfortable playing these positions. But still, they might be nice surprises for your opponent. So after d4, there are two moves here. Knight takes e4 is the best move. Another move is e takes d4. We are going to look at that first, but that move, in my opinion, isn't that good, because after e takes d4, white temporarily sacrifices the pawn to play the move e5. And after e5, the knight has to move. The only good square really is e4. If the knight goes to d5, then queen takes d4 with the tempo on the knight, and white would be virtually winning. So knight e4, because after queen takes d4, black can now play d5, defending the knight. And now you have this knight on e4, which is common in the Petrov, but as opposed to the other variations, you can capture en passant on d6, and after e takes d6, knight takes d6, the knight no longer has an outpost on e4. And after knight to c3, well, knight c6, black gains a tempo on the queen, queen to f4. I think white is slightly better. The pawn structure is symmetrical though, so not too many winning chances in an endgame, but on the other hand, you have a completely open center with all four bishops still on the board. So this, in my opinion, is a very interesting variation. It could go wrong for both sides very quickly if they aren't careful, and there are huge attacking chances for both sides, because both kings are still in the center, both kings are still two moves away from castling, and both sides have their bishops. So this variation is slightly better for white because of the development and the active queen, and the slightly misplaced knight on d6 for black, which, well, it looks awkward blocking the bishop. So I would have white here, and that's why after d4, e takes d4 is an error, and I wouldn't recommend you play that. But as I said, since you are using the modern attack as a surprise weapon, you are going to see this on the board, I'm sure. So okay, the main move knight takes e4. After knight takes e4, white can recapture on e5 immediately, or chase the knight away with bishop to d3, or try to chase the knight away. Bishop d3 is a much better move, bishop d3, and now once again d5. Now, of course, there is no en passant because you don't have a pawn on e5, but you can take knight takes e5. And now, the same way, black has an outpost on e4, white has an outpost on e5. And you could argue that white's move is more useful because white has an extra move. So if bishop d6, then castles, then castles. So obviously white has an extra move in this position, and any attacking chances are going to be on white's side. Still, you have the common Petrov symmetry here in the position with the pawns on d4 and d5, and obviously not much going on in the position. So after knight d7, knight takes d7 is the best move, bishop takes d7, white castles, bishop d6, c4, this is the one advantage white has, he gets to play c4 sooner, and c6 should be the best move, c takes d5, c takes d5, knight to c3, and the best move for black is obviously to take, because the king is still in the center. If black allows rook to e1, then white is going to be winning. So after takes, castles, the one advantage, arguably an advantage white has, is the fact that black has an isolated pawn on d5, which could be a weakness. On the other hand, white has a weakness on c3, but it can easily be defended with bishop to d2. So this setup with both bishops pointing at the king and the weakness on d5, let's say queen to f3 or queen to b3, looking at the pawn, is in my opinion slightly favorable for white. White has an obvious weakness to exploit, and his own weakness isn't really that weak. So in this position I would prefer to have white. Queen h5 is the main move, provoking the move g6, and now we get into some complications because obviously black is sacrificing a pawn. Queen takes d5, queen to c7, but black has compensation. So after b takes c3, to avoid all of this, black can try and play something passive, such as bishop to e6 to defend the d5 pawn, but in theory it's best to castle and allow this play g6, queen takes d5, queen c7, threatening h2, and now white's best move is bishop to h6, allowing this, and if black takes, of course, he's losing a piece because king h1 and losing a piece or the exchange. So the rook would be hanging and the bishop would be hanging after g3. So let me just show you this. So now black is to move, he has to save the rook, has to save the bishop, and there's no way to do both. There are no tricks, white cannot get checkmated. So after bishop to h6, rook f to d8 is the move, and now white can give up the pawn all the same, threatening to go here because queen g5. Now once again, if black takes, king h1, black isn't going to be in time to save the position, because if here, the queen is going to get to f6 and here, and the bishop cannot go to f8. It doesn't have enough time, I think. There's some problem with that, or at least black is in too much trouble already with the king so opened up. So after queen to g5, the main move is queen takes c3, rook f to d1, saving the bishop. Taking here is bad because of bishop takes here. Bishop f8, bishop takes f8, rook takes f8, rook a to c1, and a sort of equal position. The engine will tell you that it's completely equal. As I said, out of the opening, I like white's chances. So let's look at it once again. So d4 instead of taking the e5 pawn is interesting. As I said, e takes d4 can be better for white, slightly better for white. So black shouldn't play that. Knight takes c4 should be played, and then you get this position, which is symmetrical, but white gets to play c4 first and castle, and in this position after knight to c3, white is provoking some weaknesses, threatening the pawn, threatening rook to e1, so black has to take. And now if black doesn't castle, he's going to be passive. If he castles, then you get in this variation with queen to h5 and winning this pawn. So I think the modern attack is preferable for white. Not that it's winning, but it's easy to learn it, and it could be useful as a sideline to know for white. And obviously most people who play e4 want to punish the Petrov, so this could be a nice way. Okay, the next variation after knight to f6 is knight to c3. This is the 3 knights game. And first of all, I want to say that knight to c6 for black leads to the 4 knights, which is a completely different story, has nothing to do with the Petrov anymore. And we are not going to look at that. Let's just see one variation, d4, e d4. So now we are entering the Scotch variation, knight takes d4, bishop b4, knight c6, bc6, bishop d3. It's tricky and it doesn't resemble the Petrov at all, so this won't be included in the video. The only move for black to stay in the Petrov defense, the 3 knights, is the move bishop to b4. After bishop to b4, this pawn is hanging, but the e4 pawn is hanging as well if black wishes to take it with capturing on c3. So white plays knight takes e5. And this variation for black isn't really that good because of queen to e2 and stuff like that. And black could easily be in trouble. So after knight takes e5, black is best advised to castle. After castles, white should castle as well. And playing the moves such as bishop to d3, could be okay, because then you don't give back the pawn, but in theory bishop to e2 is a better move. Here bishop to e2 has been played 300 times, knight to d3 has been played 140 times, and I'm not really sure what's so wrong with bishop to d3. Let's just check with an engine, because it seems okay. Rook moves, knight moves. Yeah, it's two attackers on the pawn. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Doesn't really make sense. So after castles, bishop to e2, just giving up the pawn with your king defended is better. Rook to e8, knight to d3, bishop c3, dc3, knight takes e4, castles. And this is the variation that you are going to get out of the three knights. It has been played on the highest level. There are still about 150 games from this position, and the theory is quite developed. But nothing major for either side. And if I had to choose which sideline to play, I would always play the modern attack, because in this position white doesn't really have that much. There's no attack in the position. He has doubled pawns for the bishop pair, but I would rather have black's position, to be honest. The bishop pair doesn't really seem that dangerous at the moment. So the position would continue either with d5 or d6 for black. d5 is the main move, knight f4, c6, bishop e3, knight d6, rook to e1, normal development, and an even game. So this position, if you decide to play knight to c3, then I think you should be prepared for knight to c6, because it is the most common move entering the four knights, and the only Petrov variation which you should know is bishop to b4. So be prepared for both, and be prepared for a complex game which doesn't resemble the Petrov. On the other hand, the move d4, the modern attack, is very interesting. You're basically giving black a chance to go wrong with a visually okay move on move 3, and white is already slightly better here. And if black plays correctly, then I really don't see any problems for white. This variation is perfectly fine, and I would love to have white here. So yeah, considering the modern attack, I've been looking at it closely, and I think I'm going to play it the next time I face the Petrov, because it seems very interesting. And let me know what you think about these two sidelines. This is the end of the series on the Petrov. I hope you liked it. Hope you got to learn the opening well. I'm sorry if I missed something. Sorry if I didn't go in detail enough, or if I went too deep into some variations. And tomorrow I'm going to continue with the Scotch, and I'm looking forward to the Scotch game. It's quite aggressive and interesting. Thanks very much. Thank you once again for the comments and for the support, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye. See you later. Hi everyone, Stjepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Petrov defense with the Karklins-Martinovsky variation, which is a seldom used line that Magnus Carlsen played in the World Championship match against Fabiano Caruana last winter. And the game ended in a draw, but it's still a very interesting variation. It was pointed out in the comments, and originally I didn't mean to cover it because it's not significant enough, but then I decided to, because if Magnus Carlsen uses it, then it probably should be covered. So okay, first of all, it's a rare line, and most players with the black pieces are not going to expect that. That's the best thing about it, I would say. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight takes e5, d6, the normal move here is knight to f3. After knight to f3, you enter the Kozio, the Nimzovich, or the classical Petrov. There's also the move knight takes f7, which we've looked at before, the Cochrane Gambit. And this variation we want to look at today is knight to d3. This is the Karklins-Martinovsky variation, and as I said, not very popular. There have only been 20 games from this position on the highest level, or on the high level, so it's very rare. After knight to d3, well, there are some upsides, there are some downsides. Firstly, your knight is blocking the bishop, so d3 is not a move you can play normally, d4 as well, and still you are leaving the e4 pawn unprotected, same as with knight to f3, so black can simply take the e4 pawn. And that's what black should play. Now, the normal continuation here to justify knight d3, which seems to be disrupting white's development, is the move queen to e2, attacking the knight, and with the possibility of f3, of course, winning the knight. So after queen to e2, which is the best move for white. Black, once again, same as in the Hosiyar attack, has to play queen to e7. If the knight is protected in any way, then f3 wins the piece. So queen to e7. And here we are going to look at three different moves. Three moves which have been played before. The rarest move, the move that is least commonly played, is best according to the engines, and it's the move that Magnus Carlsen used against Fabiano Caruana, and that's the move knight to f4, which seems very strange, but it unblocks the d-pawn and prepares normal development. The other move, apart from knight to f4, we are going to look at is knight to c3, which is a combination between the Hosiyar attack and the Nimzowitsch attack, sort of allowing black to double your pawns, and then still with your knight on d3, it's hard to develop the bishop. Okay, and the third move we are going to look at is the move b3, which seems very logical in my opinion, and I think if I didn't know the position and I had to play on from here, I would probably play b3. f3 is not an option, it weakens the king side, and once the knight moves to f6 you can exchange the queens, but you don't have anything really. There are more useful moves to make. So let's look at knight to c3 first. Knight c3 is the main line. At the end of the video we are also going to look at the Carlsen-Caruana game to see how that went. Okay, knight to c3, basically asking black to take the knight. The main move is knight to f6, but if black takes on c3, then d takes c3, opening up the bishop, queen takes c2, bishop takes c2, bishop e7, castles. Not much going on here. The preferred side to castle at with your pawns doubled on the c file is queen side, which can also be played, but in this position a move such as bishop here, castles is okay, but you don't really have that many chances with the queens traded off, and it's not as aggressive. You have the bishop pair pointing at the king side but not doing much. You have a knight which is awkwardly placed on d3, and of course you are up in development, but there's nothing major going on. So the main move after bishop e7 is castle short, and after castle short this is fine, slightly better for white because of the development and nothing major going on. But after knight to c3, the main move for black isn't to take the knight, which would then of course develop the bishop. Black is much better off playing the knight to f6, because now whatever happens, and the queen exchange is going to happen, white is going to have to waste some more moves to develop the c1 bishop. So white in this position plays the move knight to f4, unblocking the d-pawn. Black exchanges, takes. Black plays c6, stopping the knights coming into b5 or d5, which can be an annoying move looking at c7, so c6 is a key move. Castles, d5, rook to e1, bishop to d6, knight h5, an exchange happens, and after knight takes h5, bishop h5 check, because the rook is checking the king, king f8, d3. Almost completely equal. I don't know what to say really. It's basically all zeros according to the engines. From a human perspective, it might be slightly easier to play for white because your king is castled, but still I think that doesn't mean that much. After a move such as g6, chasing the bishop away, king g7, the king can free up the rook. Black can develop easily, let's say bishop to f5, knight to d7, or even knight to a6, knight to c5 might come in handy, and black is basically in time to defend against any possible threats. White's c3 knight is restricted and doesn't have that much scope. The only hope I see for it is coming to g3 and into f5, if that's even a possibility. So the knight with after knight d3, knight takes e4, queen e2, queen e7. The knight with the line with knight c3, I wouldn't say is very promising for white, and I would avoid that. In either case, whether black plays knight f6 or exchanges the c3 knight, I don't think white has that much. Okay. The second move I want to look at after knight to d3, knight takes e4, queen to e2, queen to e7, is what Magnus Carlsen played. Now let's look at that. He played the move knight to f4, which might seem counterintuitive, might seem strange, but it makes some sense, freeing up the d3 pawn, and I think he chose the variation basically to confuse Fabiano Caruana, but unfortunately for Magnus, Fabiano was perfectly prepared, and he chose a variation which gave him enough chances to draw. So there are two moves here. The main move is knight to f6, offering a queen exchange, and what Fabiano Caruana played, and what I think is the best move, is knight to c6. After knight c6, you are bringing another piece into play and not immediately offering a queen trade. And the knight on c6 is very useful. It can come into d4, it can come into e5. It's defending the queen, it can come here threatening the c2 pawn, and I think this is probably the best minor piece on the board for the moment. So white, to compensate for that, because this position is equal, this is all zeros, which is very rare for white to have on move 6 to allow black to equalize. The only move to compensate for the equality is knight d5, attacking the queen. And now black shouldn't really retreat the queen. The only move to stay in the game is knight d4 counterattacking. And white doesn't have that many options. The queen, if it goes to d1, then you are looking at discovered checks. If it goes to g4, it will be taken by the bishop. h5 doesn't make much sense either. And I think that in order to defend, you need to take the black queen. Another threat you're looking at is knight takes c2. So even if you move the queen and you somehow manage to survive the discovered checks, you're still looking at knight takes c2. So white should basically take on e7. Knight takes e7, knight takes e2. Now knight to d5 by white saving the knight, knight to d4 saving black's knight, and this is what happened in their game. So we are going to look at the game later on to see how the game evolved. Now the continuation here, knight a3, knight e6, knight b5, didn't happen in the game, but I think it's very interesting because you're putting a lot of pressure on the c7 pawn, and the king has to help, so king to d8. So already you have misplaced the king. Now you need to be careful because your knights are under pressure. So f3, gaining a tempo on the knight. Knight f6, knight takes f6, g takes f6, and I like this line for white. I like this line very much, and I actually think white has chances to win this game, because the doubled f-pawns are a horrendous weakness, and if you ever manage to blockade them with the knight or with the bishop and fix them as weaknesses, then you are going to have something to exploit. Well, on the other hand, black doesn't have a single target in your position. The only weakness you have is the misplaced knight, which isn't really doing anything anymore on b5. So this variation, I think white is much better. So let's look at that once again. So knight c6 was the best move for black in my opinion. Knight d5, knight d4 counterattack, take, save the knight, knight to a3 defending c2, you need to defend this pawn, knight to e6, and now that the threat is no longer here on the c2 pawn, you can now move the knight b5 with a threat of your own. Black doesn't have a way to defend this. c6 would lose because of knight c7, so king d8, and now f3, chasing the knight away, and the knight doesn't really have to go to f6, it's just the best square. If it goes into b5, into c5, I'm sorry, then it can get harassed further on with the move b4, and it will end up on the d7 square. So f6 is objectively the best square, and after takes, doubling the pawns, white has a comfortable game. The first play I think should be employed is b3, bishop to b2, putting pressure on this diagonal. So b3, rook g8, bishop to b2, f5, saving the pawn of course, knight to d4, putting pressure on the pawn, bishop g7, ignoring that, and now the game gets complicated and you need to calculate this further. One line I found in which white sacrifices a pawn is, in my opinion, he doesn't sacrifice a pawn here, he exchanges, but I think this is still better for white. Now let's look at f5, knight d4, bishop g7 once again. Of course you don't have to go for that. Knight takes e6 undoubles the pawns, and it is with check of course, so black cannot take the bishop on b2, and it's still really hard to do something if you don't want to lose your bishop. So we should come back a few moves. f5 is the best move for black, and I think it's really hard to find that move. So after f5, perhaps knight to d4 shouldn't be the way to play. I've been looking at some other moves. Among others, I've been looking at moving the bishop, trying to sacrifice my g2 pawn, but that doesn't really work. So in the end, I ended up playing king to f2, and I found this move very interesting. I don't really know what black does. Against this, he would have to chase the knight away, but I can always play knight to c3. So I think this variation is the best way to play the Karklins-Martinovsky. So let's go back from the top. Knight e5, d6, now not knight f3, but knight d3. Knight takes e4, queen to e2, queen to e7, and the move Magnus Carlsen chose knight to f4. Now we are going to look at knight to f6 for black later on, but if black plays knight to c6, which seems to be the best option, then this line knight d5, knight d4, knight d7, knight d2, knight d5, knight d4, knight d3, knight d6, knight b5 is in my opinion better for white. Now after knight f4, the most popular move for black is knight to f6, and since Fabiano Caruana didn't choose that in the World Championship match, and I'm sure he knows it because he knows everything about the Petrov, then I think knight c6 should be favorable. After knight f6 though, white continues with knight c3, we have queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, c6, once again restraining the knight from the key squares, castles, bishop e7, d4, castles, bishop d2, rook e8, rook fe1, d5. Now we have it. After the move knight to f6, you enter the normal Petrov with white having a weird knight on f4. Now, to be honest, I have some fine squares for the knight on e5 and stuff like that, but it can always be dislodged with the move f6. And you have the symmetrical pawn structure in the Petrov, with even the white knight being in the way on c3. So I can't really find the flaw in knight to f6. If this is best play, I think that black is equal and perfectly fine. I would even argue that white has two bad knights. Both of these knights don't really look that good. So I would recommend for the players with the black pieces who play the Petrov, if you face knight f4 in this variation, to play the move knight to f6. It's simpler than knight c6, even though knight c6 is more active. I think that with knight f6 you are not going to have any problems. Now, why Caruana played knight c6, I don't know. Perhaps to confuse Magnus Carlsen, but then Magnus Carlsen was prepared as well, so what can you do? Now let's look at their game. I want to look at it from this position, knight f4, knight c6, knight e5. We already looked at this, knight d4, knight a3. Knight e6 was played in this position, but Magnus didn't choose the move knight b5, which I think is the best move, forcing the king to d8. He chose f3 first. And now in this position, it's slightly different. So Fabiano Caruana didn't go to f6, offering Magnus to double his pawns. He went to c5. And Magnus played what seems to be a pawn sacrifice here, but it can't really be taken. So he played d4, chasing the knight farther away. If the black knight takes, then knight takes c7, winning the exchange, or even the whole rook. It's questionable whether black can trap the knight. The c2 pawn is of course defended, so after knight takes d4, knight c7 check, king d8, knight takes rook. Black cannot take on c2. So this was a bluff, it wasn't a real pawn sacrifice. Knight d7, c3 solidifying d4 now. And now c6, stopping knight b5, chasing the knight away from d5. So knight f4, knight b6, bishop to d3, d5, bishop c2, and there you have it. Unfortunately, they reached the symmetrical Petrov pawn structure. The game ended in a draw. You can find it on chessgames.com, on chess database, chessbase, lichess, whatever you want. You can study the game further on, but I think that Magnus didn't use the opportunity to create an initiative in the game. So I think that the main issue here was after knight a3, knight e6, that he played f3 first. Perhaps he mixed the move order or something, but I think that the move knight b5 is a necessity, which forces the king to d8, and only after that you can play f3. And now in the same variation, of course, d4 is even more defended, so it doesn't. So it's even better for white, in my opinion. So okay, that's for that game. Now let's look at the third move. The third move I want to look at, which I find very interesting to fight the Petrov in this variation, is move b3. The move b3 simply prepares to develop the bishop to the most natural diagonal, putting pressure here, and doesn't do much about the d3 pawn, the d2 pawn. Black continues with knight c6, bishop b2, bishop to f5, defending the knight, knight to c3, and now black's best option is to capture. Knight takes c3. You can capture with the bishop, and that's a good move, but you'd be surprised that the best move and the main move, well, in the only game ever played, is d takes c3. The point of d takes c3 is that you are restraining the black knight from coming into b4 and d4, and you are also putting the brakes on d5, d4. So this move, even though it might seem counterintuitive, can have several purposes. Now, if black doesn't stop the move c4, then white is going to have a great position. Okay, queen takes c2, bishop takes e2, and black now immediately plays the move d5. He wants to play d4, and he's also stopping the move c4. White castles queenside, white castles queenside, bishop to d6 developing, bishop to f3, attacking the pawn, bishop e6 defending g3, defending h2 so that the rook can move, castles long, rook h to e1. And this is the start of the variation, and I think that it's imbalanced enough for either side to be able to win. I wouldn't say that white is better, but if you are looking for imbalances against the Petroff, this variation might be fine. And you might even encounter players with black who are unfamiliar with the line, which of course is going to happen because it has only been played 20 times, knight to d3. So I think this is very promising. Let's continue. Rook h to e8, white plays h4 gaining space, knight to e7, and now there's a strange move for white which I don't really like. This is the pawn sacrifice I mentioned before, which the engine likes, and I would never play it during a real game. So you are looking at the g7 pawn with your bishop, so the idea is to sacrifice your pawn here to take on g7, but I don't really like that. The line goes c4, dc4, bc4, bishop takes c4, and after bishop takes g7, bishop takes a2. And apparently this is equal, and white has compensation for the pawn because he opened up the queen side, and that might be true, but I still think that there isn't enough compensation for the pawn. There could be some lines, let's say you try to bring your rooks to b1 and to a1. Now immediately if you play the move king to d2, you're going to be in trouble almost. Still the bishop is saving the position, but let's say this happens, check. Here you would have to give up your bishop, and as the pieces get traded off, there are less and less chances for a successful attack. So I really don't believe that this pawn sacrifice is enough. But if you come back to b3, and this position, perhaps even taking with the bishop, without the idea of c4, let's say queen takes, bishop takes c3, queen takes here, bishop takes here, let's say black castles, white castles. I like white's chances here. I think the bishop is great and it's putting pressure on the diagonal, and I think that if anyone can be in trouble, then it's going to be black. So yeah, I would recommend this move. Knight to f4 seems interesting, but as I said, in this position after knight to f4, I'm worried about the move knight to f6 and the complete equality. After knight c6, as I said, as we saw in the Carlsen-Caruana game, white stands better, but after knight f6 it's completely equal. And the move b3 promises inequality, at least in the pawn structure and in the piece activity. So I think that b3 should be your preferred method to play this variation. Still, to conclude, I think that after d6, knight to d3 might be a nice sideline to confuse black. I still prefer the Nimzowitsch attack after knight to f3, but this is playable and you are giving your opponent chances to go wrong, and that's what makes it definitely interesting. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Hope you liked the variation. Once again, you can find the Carlsen-Caruana game online if you want to look at the whole game. Let me know what you think about the variation. Let me know if you've ever played it or seen it. And once again, thank you for the support. Thank you for the comments. And stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Petroff defense with my favorite variation, the Nimzowitsch attack, and what I believe is the most aggressive variation white could play against the Petroff. Now, in the introductory video, we've been looking over the options for black and for white, and I gave you a brief intro to the ideas for both sides, so if you haven't seen the introductory video, please do. And today we are going to focus on the Nimzowitsch attack. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight to f6, the Petroff defense, instead of defending with knight to c6, attacking the e4 pawn instead, or counter-attacking. And white continues with his most principled move, takes the pawn, black plays d6. As we said, knight takes e4 isn't a good idea, it gives white a better position. The knight should retreat. There are options of knight c4 and knight d3. As was mentioned in the comments, knight to d3 was played by Magnus Carlsen in the World Championship match, and I'm going to go over that variation in a separate video. But knight to f3 is the main move, and after knight takes e4, yesterday we went over d4, the classical attack or the classical variation, also the main line, which is considered to be the most principled way for white to fight the Petroff defense. We are also going to go over the move queen to e2. I'm going to cover that tomorrow. And today we are looking at the most aggressive move, and the move which comes with a concession immediately, knight to c3. And the concession is that you are basically giving black the option to take your knight and double your pawns, which means that you are going to have a worse structure. Now, with that comes the very aggressive idea of white castling queenside and crushing black, and this is why I like the variation. I have only played, one tournament game in this variation, and it ended up being pretty boring. Unfortunately, the variation went, I took with the pawn, and I ended up playing knight d4 with my pawn on c3. He took with his c6 knight, and we got a completely symmetrical pawn structure like this, and the game ended in a draw. But if your opponent wishes to play risky chess, then you are going to have a risky game. Of course, black can play it safely, black can play it aggressively, and white is basically giving up his intentions pretty early on with 5 knight to c3. We are going to look at two sidelines. Of course, taking is the main move, but I want to look at two moves first. By far the most popular is knight takes c3, and there have been about 500 games with the move knight to f6. Among others, Wang Hao played it, Wesley So played it, Vladimir Kramnik played it, so it's definitely a playable move. But I think that it's not the best move. Now, once d4 is played, white sort of wishes this knight weren't here, and that's the point of knight to f6, because it's now really hard to play the move c4, and even though the knight is controlling nice squares in the center and on the queen side, white would really like to have it on c3 after the pawn has moved to c4. So this variation sort of doesn't give white the option to expand any further, because he doesn't have the e pawn and the c4 pawn is locked. So bishop to e7, bishop to d3, castles, white plays h3, preventing bishop to g4, rook to e8, and now castles to get away from any discoveries. And this position is equal, I would say, because white is up in development, and black has to sort out his queenside pieces, but it's really hard for white to do much to punish that. And that's why I think knight to f6 is an okay move, but still taking should be better. Knight bd7 developing, rook to e1, knight to f8 is the plan, coming into g6, and the most aggressive try for white, which I don't really like, is d5 in this position, a move which gains space in the center and reduces the scope of the white pieces, stops knight to e6, but it does give away two key squares, c4, c5 and e5, so if the knight ever maneuvers back, then these two squares are going to be great, especially the e5 square. So this variation, well, if this is the way to fight for white, and white is slightly better, then fine, but I'm not too convinced that there's anything much going on here. The good thing for white is that the bishop on c8 doesn't have scope. Where do you develop the bishop? You can only go to d7. On the other hand, if white manages to play a maneuver such as b6, bishop b7, then the overextended d5 pawn is going to be in trouble. So yeah, black should probably play h6 here to stop the development of the c1 bishop, because I think most often white wants to trade off this bishop for the knight to make sure he can remaneuver his pieces and then play c4 to make sure this bishop is stupid for the rest of the game. So f6 is a playable move. And if you want to play it with the black pieces, then, well, you are not accepting the gift that white gave you, doubling his pawns. And still, if you double the pawns, if you take on c3, the position isn't over, the position isn't much better for white. He just has better attacking chances, so I wouldn't recommend this. Another sideline I want to look at, I really don't think is good, is d5. And this sort of tries to go into the classical, into the main line with the knight being on c3, which is awkward. So if white continues with the move d4, then he has a bad classical with the knight on c3, which means that he cannot play the move c4, and you're once again giving black the option to double your pawns in a less favorable way. So after d5, the main move for white is queen to e2, and now after bishop to e7, which is black's best move, white can win a pawn. For some reason, knight takes c3 isn't popular here. I'm sorry, it's impossible here, but in the earlier variation, knight takes c3 wasn't possible. So For some reason, this variation seems to be playable for black, and people seem to play it even though I don't see the compensation for the pawn. So obviously bishop to e7 threatens to take on c3, but yeah, after bishop to e7, just simply knight e4, d4, queen e4, castles, threatening rook to e8, but black is too slow because of bishop c4. He still has to move the bishop, bishop f6 and castles. After rook to e8, queen to f4. I mean, if you can see the compensation for the pawn, please let me know. I just cannot see it. And white actually wins 75% of these games, which is really rare for the Petroff. So this move, in my opinion, should be avoided. After knight c3, d5, after queen e2, well, what do? I mean, bishop e7 is the most popular move. The engine says bishop e7 and +1 for white. I don't think you can do much else. Perhaps, nothing really. Perhaps you can try to defend like this, but I guess it's bad for some reason. I'm not sure. Yeah, just d3. Yeah. Okay, so this variation I wouldn't say is playable. So after knight c3, d5, and trying to enter the normal classical Petroff doesn't really work. So okay, let's finally go to the main move and the most principled move, and the move that you're going to see in 99% of your games, knight takes c3. You always have to take with the d-pawn, because your intention is to castle queenside, and the fact that you are bringing another pawn to the center with b takes c3 doesn't really help. dc3, black's main and best and probably only move is bishop to e7, preparing to castle, leaving the option of either bishop to e6, knight to c6 or castles, which are the three moves black generally wants to play. White now continues either with bishop f4 or bishop to e3, and you always move the bishop and the queen in these variations because you want to castle queenside as soon as possible. Bishop to f4, I would say slightly inferior, and it's also a rarer move. Here, black continues either with knight c6 or castles, and if black castles, then knight d7 is the move to play, staring at e5 and c5. And after knight to c6, the plans are slightly different. So after knight c6, queen to d2, bishop to e6, castles. You might wonder what about this pawn. We are going to look at several possibilities and several positions in which black does take. But queen to d7 is the main move, and now king to b1. And black is going to castle queen side, and black doesn't want to accept an opposite side castling position in which, well, white stands slightly better, because white has the semi-open d file and his major pieces are more active. So yeah, castles queenside and black should be fine. If after bishop e6 castles, black decides to take the pawn, then in theory white is winning, but there have been some games where strong players have taken the pawn and they've managed to win, so it's not that simple. The point is that after b3 trapping the bishop, black has the advance a5, a4, and this is a theme which you need to remember in case black ever captures, and in case you play the Petroff with the black pieces, then you need to remember that sometimes you can get ample compensation for the piece. So a5, king to b2, threatening to take the bishop, a4, king takes a2, a takes b3, king takes b3, castles. Now here the engine says white is winning, it's +2, but I'm not really sure about this variation. It seems fairly tricky because your king is almost completely naked on the queen side. The only defense it has are the c2 and the c3 pawns and the pieces. And the rook is already on the open a file, the queen can join the rook, the knight is able to check immediately from a6. The bishop seems scary after the move d5, so yeah, I really think that black has sufficient chances in this opening, and that black should be okay with great play. Of course, if you are playing a supercomputer or a strong grandmaster, then well, you might win with white pieces, but I think this is scary. The engines think that bishop to e2 is the best move, trying to get the other rook into play, and still don't take the pawn if you are not sure that you can win this position with black. Try to find some tricks and perhaps you can do well. So let's go back. After knight c6, queen to d2, bishop to e6 castles. Bishop to e6 castles is one variation, and now queen to d7, king b1, castles queenside is what you should play. The other move after knight c6, queen to d2, the other move which I find great is the move bishop g4. This move simply pins the knight to the king, And still, after black castles queenside, which is going to happen, black will often have a chance to double up the pawns on the f-file, which is going to be useful in an endgame. White continues with bishop to e2, therefore, trying to stop this idea. Queen to d7, castles. Yeah, and I think that the move bishop to g4 is slightly better because there are none of these teams with bishop takes a2, and the fact that you can get your bishop to g6 or back to e6 if need be. So white should play h3 here, chasing the bishop away. And there are some ideas with bishop h5 and here. You're not really worried about this move because for now the bishop is defending, but even if it wasn't, allowing this capture would open up the black rook and black would be fine. So yeah, but the main move isn't bishop to h5, it's bishop to e6, staring at the a2 pawn, which I guess is more active, but I actually like the bishop on g6. I've been looking at positions with getting my bishop to g6. And now white doesn't have to defend the pawn really because the rook isn't on a8, so king b1 is unnecessary, b3 is unnecessary. You can just play rook h to e1, getting your other rook to the center. And I think that this position is very promising. There are a lot of things going on. Of course, in any endgame, black is going to be slightly better because he has a better pawn structure, but there's a long way to utilizing that advantage. And even though it's doubled pawns, it doesn't really mean that much because on the other side of the board, the pawn structure is symmetrical. The kings are castled queenside, so the white king can safeguard these pawns. And if you remove all the pieces of the board, I don't think black can win this. So okay, this was the move bishop to f4, and the bishop on f4, yeah, after bishop f4 let's look at castles too. We just looked at knight to c6. The problem with bishop to f4 is that sometimes you're going to return it to e3. If black castles here, which is I think great for white because white would like to have opposite side castling to increase the attacking chances. Queen to d2, knight to d7. As I said, when you castle short, then your knight doesn't really belong on c6, your knight belongs in the center, controlling e5 and c5. White castles, knight c5 immediately, and now bishop to e3. Bishop to e3 doesn't really threaten to take the knight, that's not the main move in the variation if black doesn't do anything, but I like the move bishop takes knight. And even though you give black the bishop pair, you can exchange the queens off and have a slightly better position. But yeah, the theory doesn't like the move and the engines don't like the move. So after rook to e8, bishop takes c5 is equal. You have gained the tempo because of rook to e8, so now after takes, the bishop will probably take. And white stands slightly better, a bit more space, a bit more development. You could say a target on c5, but it can be defended with b6, but realistically, not too many chances. So after rook to e8, you should just try to continue normally with your development. Moves such as bishop to c4 and then getting your other rook to e1. Ideas with h4 and trying to open up the king side also come to mind because this knight, well, it is controlling the e4 square and it can jump into e4 right now, but how useful is that really? So okay, after castles, remember that you simply go for your plan, queen d2, knight d7 castles, and if knight c5 comes, you can ignore that. You can also take it if you are hoping for a draw, but yeah, I would recommend that you play bishop to e3, and after rook to e8, play normal developing moves, or play h4, h5. But as I said, bishop f4 is not the main move. After knight c3, knight takes c3, d takes c3, bishop to e7, the main move is bishop to e3. And now, if the variation with knight c5 should happen, you at least have the option of taking the knight immediately, if you should wish so. And the bishop also seems more useful on e3 than on f4 in my opinion, because on f4 it's staring at this wall of pawns and it doesn't have too many targets. Okay. Now black has two options, once again, either castles short or knight to c6, once again with the same ideas in mind. If knight c6 is played, black wants to castle queenside. If black castles kingside, then you already know, and you want h4, h5 and pushing on. So for black I would recommend the move knight c6 here, and it is the main move. Let's just briefly look at castles. Castles, queen to d2 of course, and play is fairly simple for white. These three moves are going to be played always. So knight to d7, castles, knight to e5. And here, once again, you can take, but you don't have to. If black wishes to take on f3, then fine, you're opening up the g file, and you would actually be happy for that to happen. At the moment, black is threatening the move knight to c4. I'm sorry, forking your queen and bishop, but you don't really care about that either, because if that's played, and let's say the knight is defended, let's say the bishop is on e6, which can happen. If that happens, you can simply take the knight off, because your bishop is still undeveloped. So black will have lost 1, 2, 3 moves to capture, and you have developed your undeveloped piece to take. So this is favorable when it comes to development. So in this position, you are not really worried about any knight maneuvers. The knight looks nice, but it doesn't really do much. So in this position, you can actually continue your attack with h4. And this is, I think, the best way to punish castling kingside. And you have to be quick. The thing which you can probably conclude immediately visually is that black is far away from creating any sort of attacking chances. And if you can imagine bishop f6, bishop e6, c5, b5 or something like that, then sure, black has some options in the attack. But for now, not a single piece apart from the e5 knight is threatening anything in white's position, and white sort of has a free hand in the attack. And if you manage to get your pawn to h6, provoke g6, or if you manage to open up the g file with knight takes f3, then yeah, it could get scary quickly for black. So this was the sideline with castles, which I wouldn't recommend. After bishop to e3, I would suggest for black the move knight to c6. And knight to c6 prepares to castle queenside. Queen to d2, the same moves for white, and black plays bishop to e6 here, preparing the move queen to d7, castles queenside. And that's very simple for black. It's easy to learn, and you can remember your setup in the main line. Your queen is going to d7 and your king is castling along. So this is fairly simple to play with the black pieces, as opposed to the classical which we saw yesterday, which is horrible. Okay, now once again the question of bishop takes a2 comes to mind. Still white can castle, and still queen to d7 is the main move. Let's look at what happens if bishop takes a2 in this position. If bishop takes a2, once again b3, a5, king to b2, a4. Now the difference is that rook to a1 is slightly more powerful, which means that you can exchange the a8 rook, which is great, because that reduces the chances of your king being checkmated. Rook a1, ab3, cb3, the bishop is still loose, black can take on b3, and now you exchange the rooks, queen takes a8, king takes b3. There are some checks, there are queen a1 infiltrations, but there isn't really much going on, and I think that this position is much better for white, and that there is no compensation for the piece. Queen a1 is the best move, and in this position there have been 4 games, 2 ended in a draw, and 2 were won by white, so black can't really do much, but apparently black can defend. Queen c1, trying to force an exchange of queens, knight a5 check, it's fine, king c2, queen a4 check, king b1, knight c4 is the main move, trading of the pieces, and here I really don't think that black has anything for the piece. The rook is far away from being developed. The best idea might be king d7, rook a8, but still white would have to go badly wrong to lose the game. Okay, so after castles, bishop takes a2 really shouldn't be played, even though some strong players managed to draw the game. I really wouldn't recommend it because of the variation we just saw. Instead of that, queen to d7 and simply preparing to castle. King b1 now, defending the pawn and also removing the king from harm's way, from this diagonal, which might be tricky. Bishop to f6. And now once again, h4 is the main move, but I don't really like the move because the black king hasn't castled kingside yet. So h4 is the main idea here, expanding on the king side, but let's try to find something better. I like the move bishop to g5, simply trying to trade off the bishop because this f6 bishop seems fairly strong. And I also like the idea of h3, g4 and trying to fianchetto my bishop. So h4 is the main move, but after castles, knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, this move doesn't really seem that useful. Okay, if you can manage to get in f3, g4 and g5, then at least you are forcing a trade of these bishops, looking at a7, looking at g7, but I'm not sure that can ever happen. Let's look at the main line and then try to find some more ideas. Bishop to e5 is the main move, bishop to e2, queen a4, b3 now chasing the queen away, queen a5, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, queen to g5. You are sacrificing the f3 pawn, but that's what's supposed to happen. You're going to take on g7, queen c3, queen g7, a5, and as I said, I don't really like this position for white, even though the engine says white is better. I think that black has great chances. As opposed to every other variation we were looking at, I think black is actually the one in the driver's seat here and the one attacking. So this main line, even though it seems much better for white, I just don't like it. So after the move bishop to f6, I want to look at the move bishop to g5, which forces a trade, which I think is okay. Black isn't going to take. I think black is just going to castle and try to use the open file, and after takes, this is going to be fine, even though the structure is ruined. Yeah, or queen to e7 can also be played, and bishop takes g5 can also be played, but now after takes, I guess knight takes, and if you can win this bishop, then fine. So bishop to g5 seems like an okay move, at least preventing black from gaining equality in development and castling normally. At least it does something to stop that. And another move, and my favorite move in this position, a move which I've played a lot, is h3. After h3, black should castle, and now after the move g4, I really like my bishop here. Let's say rook to e8, I face this, bishop to g2, and these two bishops seem great. And I think that my bishops are better than black's bishops, especially the dark squared bishop. And I think that there are threats like knight d4 now. If knight takes, bishop takes, then I have threats on g7. I can even recapture with the queen and exchange several pieces. And I think that white stands better here. So I definitely like the move h3 more than I like the move h4. I think this makes a lot of sense. If you ask the engine what it thinks, it says it's equal, but black really has to prove that it's equal. I don't think that black is as good as in the h4 variation. At the end, I want to look at one game where Vishy Anand played Shahryar Mamedyarov, so two super grandmasters battling in the Nimzovich attack of the Petrov. And in the game, Anand played some strange plans and still managed to win, but was worse at a point. So what happened was the main line, knight takes c3, d takes c3, bishop to e7, bishop to e3, knight to c6 was played, so with the plan of castling queenside, queen to d2, bishop to e6, castles, and here Mamedyarov played a strange move. He played a6, a move which shouldn't really be played. As I said, queen to d7 is the main move. You want to castle as soon as possible. a6 doesn't really do that much. It prevents bishop to b5, but bishop to b5 really isn't a threat anyway. a6, and now Vishy Anand returned the favor. He played move b3, which, I mean, it's a target now. Your king is stuck on c1. And with the pawn on b3, a5, a4 is a strong maneuver. With the pawn on b2, a4, a5, a4 doesn't really exist as an attacking idea. Much better was king to b1, serving the same purpose, defending the pawn and solidifying the position. After b3, Mamedyarov played h6, another strange move. Bishop to e2 was played now. Another inaccuracy, queen to d7 finally, king b1, and I think many people would rather have the pawn on b2 now. Bishop to f6, and now even the c3 pawn is weak. So yeah, I really don't like white's position. The engine says that white is slightly better, but I think black is fine, even though black wasted two moves on a6 and h6. Knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, bishop takes d4, queen takes d4, at least relieving the pressure of c3. Castles, and now c4. This maneuver I liked. And the engine will tell you that it's equal, the material is completely equal, black has a better pawn structure, and not much going on, despite all the inaccuracies. Rook f8, bishop f3, improving the pieces, rook a to b8. This was the wrong plan. The engine wants him to play rook to d8, but still I think b5 is very sensible because you have all of these anchors in white's position, and let's say d5 or b5 could be really annoying. c5 was played here by Vishy Anand to stop all of these ideas. You cannot take, of course, you lose the bishop. d5, h4, b6, rook h to e1. And the game continued from here, from an equal position. Vishy Anand managed to win in the end, but I just wanted to illustrate how a small mistake, even by a great player, could mean a worse position. So after castles here, a6 was the mistake by Mamedyarov, b3 was the mistake by Anand. And of course, these moves aren't losing, they're playable, you can play such ideas. But I think it's very important to play the Nimzovich attack precisely, because if you don't, let's say Mamedyarov played the move a6 here and Vishy and Anand played the best move, then he could have gotten an advantage very early on. Okay. To finish the video, I would like to recommend that you take at least 10 or 20 games after knight c3 and knight takes c3, d takes c3. So in the main line of the Nimzovich attack, and study the plans. And you should try to find small inaccuracies like this one. And of course, since Vishy Anand won the game, many people wouldn't notice b3 as a mistake. But you should look at the games regardless of the result and try to find mistakes for both sides and try to find the way to punish them, even though the players didn't do it in the game. So b3 is, I think, a very weakening move, and if I were black, I would try to castle kingside and play a5, a4 as soon as possible, because I don't see a comfortable way to defend against that. So try to find games like this one, try to study them, try to find weakening moves for both sides, and then try to use those moves when you face them in the real game. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks very much for the comments and for the support. Let me know what you think about the variation. This is my favorite way to fight the Petrov defense. And stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye. Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the Petrov defense series with the ideal drawing weapon for white, which is sad to say, but the Hosiyar attack or the Lasker attack, even though it has attack in its name, should be called the Hosiyar draw. Especially on the highest level, about 90% of the games end in a draw. So if you are looking for a peaceful way to tame the Petrov, then this is the variation for you. I have to say I'm irritated to cover it even, and I really don't like it because it forces an exchange of queens early on in the game, but still it has to be mentioned, and it has been played by several strong players. One very exciting game which I would point out is Kramnik Caruana from the Candidates 2018. You can find it on my channel, and it's probably the most exciting game ever played in that variation. But the majority of other games end in a draw. So let's see the variation. e4, e5, knight f3, knight to f6, the Petrov defense or the Russian defense. Knight takes e5, white's most principled move, d6 chasing the knight away, the only move. By the way, if you haven't seen the introductory video on the Petrov, please do, to make sure you understand the moves such as knight takes e4 and why they don't really work. So d6, knight f3, knight takes e4, black takes back the pawn, and now white doesn't go for the classical, doesn't go for the Nimzovich, which we have covered in the last two videos. White goes for the move queen to e2, which is the Hosiyar attack or the Lasker attack. And even though this move might seem aggressive, attacking the knight in the most direct fashion, it really doesn't give white that many attacking chances, and we are going to see why. First of all, black has only one move, queen to e7. Defending the knight in any way, either with the bishop or one of the pawns, would be met by d3, winning the knight because the knight is pinned to the king. So black has to unpin and defend at the same time. Moving the knight is illegal, of course. So queen to e7, defending the knight and unpinning the knight. White now has only one good move, that's d3, chasing the knight away. Any other move would be met by d5, defending the knight, and then you would have the knight stuck in the center with your queen misplaced on e2, which means that your bishop is blocked. I have been looking at some variations with d4, d5, g3 and trying to put the bishop on g2, but this knight is just too annoying, and if you go for the variation with g3, bishop g2, then it's really hard to remove the knight without playing f3, and you are either going to have doubled pawns here, or you are going to have to capture the knight with your knight, which means that the d5 pawn is going to come to e4, misplacing your f3 knight. So after queen to e2, queen to e7, there really is only one option, and that's d3. Now, black has tried knight to c5, but the knight isn't really that good on c5, so the only move for black is knight to f6, returning the knight back to safety. And now white has a choice. White can either play bishop g5, knight c3, or take the queen immediately. In any case, unless black plays bishop e6 for some reason, which isn't really a good move because his f8 bishop is blocked, same as the f1 bishop, the queens are going to get traded off. So now let's look at some of the variations. Even though bishop g5 is the main move, knight to c3 is preferred by the strongest players, and it has been played by Magnus Carlsen, Wesley So, Pentala Harikrishna, Hikaru Nakamura, and others. So knight to c3 seems to be the most popular option. So we are going to look at that first. After knight to c3, black should exchange the queens off to make sure he is able to develop normally. So queen takes e2, bishop takes e2, and here you have the beginning of the Cosio attack with the queens traded off. And you have the queens of the board, you have a symmetrical pawn structure, and of course on my level, low levels, anything can happen. I mean, nothing is clear here. But on the highest level, and even on grandmaster levels, normal grandmaster levels, this should be a draw, because what can you do to create an imbalance? It's really hard. Usually games are won or lost because imbalances are created, and here the only imbalance you could try to create is to play knight to e4 and allow black to capture and try to make the pawn structure at least asymmetrical with your pawn on e4. But that really shouldn't be enough, because it's really hard to create a pawn majority on any side of the board, and it's really hard to checkmate without the queens on, especially with such development on the board, with each side still having to castle. So bishop takes e2. Now there are two moves. Bishop e7 is the main move, after which castles is played, and it's hard really to point out any attacking plans for either side. I'm really struggling to find any attacking ideas here. In my opinion, what white should do is play either bishop f4 or bishop g5, get his rook to e1, get his other rook to d1, try to get some chances that way. Perhaps the best idea would be to double the rooks on the e-file, which is really hard to do with the bishop stuck on e2. So not much going on. The other move, which has been played by Fabiano Caruana, there have only been 9 strong games with this move, but most of them are by Fabiano, is the move g6, which at least tries to create an imbalance this way without putting the bishop on e7, where it doesn't have that much scope. With g6 you are hoping to put the bishop on a much more active diagonal and at least cause some problems for white on the queen side. So now bishop to g5 is the move. Bishop g7, castles long by white to create some imbalances, and castles short by black. And this is what I would say the most promising variation for both sides, and here you have the most chances in the variation. White can look forward to some ideas of taking the f6 knight and playing h4, h5. This is, I believe, a sensible plan for an attack. On the other hand, if you leave the e-file, then black could take the e-file, so it might not be as good. But I have been looking at some positions with king d2, rook d2, e1, h4, h5, taking the knight and trying to open up the position. But it's not really clear that white has anything. Here I would like to look at one game played between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana, which featured a similar variation. So after bishop to e2, Fabiano Caruana did play g6. You can see the evaluation on the right side of the board, so you can see that I'm telling the truth regarding the equality of the variation. In this position, knight to d4 was played instead of bishop to g5, and a6 was played, stopping either knight from coming to b5, which is okay because knight b5 was a threat. Now on the previous move, knight b5 would have to be met by knight a6, but that's a common move anyway. I believe that king to d8 would also be fine. I was looking at this position and I think king d8 is also okay, but perhaps more sensible is knight to a6, because there's no way to remove the knight unless you move the b5 knight. But after knight to d4, Fabiano did choose a6, stopping knight b5. Bishop f4 was played instead of bishop g5, and black already has a slight edge, because the knight on d4 and the bishop on f4 are slightly awkward. bishop g7, h3, stopping knight g4, bishop g4, and any ideas like that, basically restraining the pieces. And there's one thing about this variation which can be instructive. You are playing with the minor pieces for the biggest part of the middle game and the late opening, and usually whichever side has more space will be better with a lot of minor pieces on the board. So the main idea in the opening is to restrain the minor pieces, and as you can see, the last couple of moves have been doing exactly that. a6 restrains the knights, h3 restrains the knights and the knight and the bishop. So both sides are basically trying to reduce the scope of their opponent's pieces. So that's a very important thing to do. Sometimes even instead of developing, this might be a better idea. Okay, bishop to d7 was played, developing the bishop. Bishop to f3, putting the bishop on the long diagonal. Knight to c6, the reason why bishop here was played. And now Magnus Carlsen gets to double Caruana's pawns, but knight c6, bishop c6, bishop c6, bc6. Still an imbalance created, but you could argue that black profited slightly more from this trade because he now has the semi-open b file. And with the move rook to b8, let's say if b3 was played, then all of a sudden knight h5 is a very scary variation. The bishop would have to retreat and stuff like that. So it's not as if Fabiano Caruana accepted to be worse. I think that he got enough compensation for these doubled pawns. And still, the c6 pawn cannot be attacked easily by the knight. And there's no light squared bishop to attack it. So these pawns aren't really targets. Castle's queenside was played by Magnus Carlsen, which is a very sensible move. Simply defending the b2 pawn, and black doesn't have nearly enough firepower to cause any issues on b2 now. Fabiano chose king to d7 here, which is probably the best move. Castles would bring the king to g8, which doesn't make much sense. Rook h to e1, rook h to e8, knight to e4, as I said, trying to create an imbalance here. Knight d5, bishop d2, f5, chasing the knight away, knight to g5, h6, chasing the knight away, knight to f3. As I said, reducing the scope of the pieces, expanding when it's safe to expand and when it's a multi-purpose move. So Fabiano Caruana with this maneuver f5, h6 took away some squares from the knight and expanded on the king side, which could come in handy. The only downside is that the h6 pawn is now weak because the bishop is stuck defending it, and if it moves, the knight is going to have the g5 square. So now to stop both of these ideas, g5 was played, which is once again the best move. Defending h6, stopping knight g5 forever, relieving this bishop of its duty. c3, reducing the scope of the knight, making the bishop able to move. And defending the b2 pawn. c5, trying to undermine this structure. King to c2, defending. Bishop f6. Rook takes e8, rook takes e8, rook to e1, rook to f8, declining a trade. Rook h1, rook e8, g3, g4, knight g1, bishop g5, a trade offered, king d1, a5, knight e2, and not really much going on. I mean, this variation is playable, and as you can see, Fabiano Caruana strived for an imbalance with the move g6, bishop g7, and he got some imbalances, and he even accepted doubled pawns on the c file, but this is not nearly enough for strong grandmasters to get a win. There aren't enough weaknesses, and there aren't enough attacking chances. The game ended in a draw in about 10 moves. Okay, so I wanted to show you that game. So the move g6 is definitely interesting, and after bishop to g7 here, Magnus decided not to castle, which is the main move. He played the move knight to d4, which creates a threat. As I said, knight to b5 could also be a threat. But castling makes perfect sense. And after castles, as I said, I like white's chances more than in the other lines. After knight c3, queen takes e2, bishop takes e2. If black goes bishop e7, castles, then there really isn't that much going on in the position. Okay, let's go back to the opening. Knight f3, knight takes e4, queen e2, queen e7, d3, knight f6. Let's look at the other two moves. The other option white could go for is that white exchanges the queens. Bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, bishop takes e7, and at least this move doesn't allow black to go for the variation g6, bishop g7, which might be a good idea. But you gave black the chance to develop his bishop instead of you developing your own with tempo after you take the queen. So now after knight to c3, once again, the position is equal. Bishop g5 could be played later on. Let's say black castles, bishop g5, castles queenside at some point. You could strive for imbalances, and that's the best idea here, but as I said, not much going on. So let's look at the main move now. Knight f6, bishop g5 is the main move. Pinning the knight to the queen. And now to unpin, black has only one good move, and that's to take the queen. If you don't, then white is simply going to capture the knight, and you are going to have to recapture with the pawn. And let's say black plays something stupid, knight c6, then takes the queen. Takes the knight. The queen is pinned to the king, so you cannot take. You have to take with the pawn, and whatever happens now, you are going to have two targets to exploit. Especially if this bishop gets traded off, then a maneuver like knight h4, knight f5 would be really strong, and white would actually be better in that variation. So after bishop to g5, black should take the queens off, queen takes c2, bishop takes c2, bishop to e7. As I said, it's really hard even in this variation to play g6 because the knight would be hanging. So both the main variation with bishop g5 and the direct capture of the queen on e7 makes g6, bishop g7 impossible, which is a good thing because you reduce the number of options black has. Knight c3, c6, depriving the knight of the key squares in the center, d5 and b5. Castles queenside. Knight a6, the knight is coming into c5 or into c7. Rook h to e1, knight c7, knight e4, knight takes c4, d takes c4. This is the biggest imbalance you could hope to create. Bishop takes g5, knight takes g5, king to e7 is the main move. And here I would say that white stands slightly better. White did manage to get something out of the opening. He has a definite lead in development, so all of the white pieces have been developed, the rooks have been connected, and black is yet to develop his bishop and to connect the rooks. So white is definitely better theoretically here, but practically speaking, is there any chances? Of course there is. Your opponent could always make a mistake, but with good play, it's just a draw. From this position on, there have been, let me count, 35, 40, about 45 games played, and 95% of the games ended in a draw. So yeah, not much to say about this variation. So let's return to the opening. e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, knight e5, d6, knight f3, knight e4, queen e2. Remember for black that you have to play queen to e7, otherwise you lose the knight. d3 chasing the knight away, d4 and stuff like that doesn't really work because you're stuck with the knight on e4. d3, knight f6. Now you could either go for knight c3, Magnus Carlsen's choice, bishop g5, which is the main line, or queen takes c7. I think that bishop g5 is the best attempt because knight c3 allows the variation with g6, bishop g7. Not that there's much in it for black, but still you should reduce the options. So bishop g5, black should now take because otherwise he's going to end up with doubled f-pawns. Queen takes c2, bishop takes c2, bishop e7. Your knight always goes to c3 because you want to castle queenside. c6 castles, and yeah, this is the starting position of the opening. One theme that should be remembered is knight to e4 and putting your pawn on e4. After that you might try playing f3, moving your other knight, getting your knight into d4, trying to create some chances like that. But as I said, not much going on. So if you are looking for a perfect way to tame the Petroff defense, then the Hosiyar draw is should be your weapon of choice. Play queen to e2. You are certain that you are going to trade the queens off, get a symmetrical position in which neither side has too many attacking chances. So if you are playing a much higher rated opponent, then this might be the move to make. If you are playing a much lower rated opponent, this might be the move to make, because in my experience lower rated players don't know how to deal with slow positions, and they always want to attack and do something. So it might be an interesting weapon. If Magnus Carlsen played it, Hikaru Nakamura played it, Hare Krishna played it, Kramnik played it, Wesley So played it, then it must be a good variation, but still I think it's likely to end in a draw. So in my opinion, the previous video, the Nimzowitsch attack, should be your weapon of choice if you want to win. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Thanks very much for the support and the kind comments. Please let me know what you think about this drawing weapon for white. Let me know if you have played it successfully and won, and I want to know how. I really do. Thanks very much. Stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.